Get comfortable. Turn off the lights if you want. Pull whatever blanket you have closer, because what follows is going to take a while, and that is entirely the point. This is not the kind of content where you need to be sitting up straight, taking notes. This is the kind of content you let wash over you while the night gets quieter and the world outside does its thing. What we are going to explore tonight is Family Guy, specifically the parts of Family Guy that most people have never seen, never heard about, or never fully understood. The banned episodes, the pulled scenes, the deleted content that sat on a shelf somewhere for years before anyone knew to look for it. The theories that fans built in the dark corners of the internet, late at night, just like this. The real documented controversies that the network buried. The things that aired once and then quietly vanished. And the stranger, murkier territory of what might exist that nobody has found yet. We are going to move through all of it slowly, with care and detail, and we are going to take our time. So settle in. Part 1. What it means for something to be lost. Before we can talk about lost episodes and buried conspiracies, it is worth sitting with the idea of what it actually means for something in television to be lost. Because most people assume that in the age of streaming and digital archives and YouTube and the internet broadly, nothing can really disappear. The assumption is that everything is out there somewhere, if you know where to look. Hard drives do not decay the way film does. Servers do not burn. A show that aired on television in 1999 should be perfectly recoverable in 2025, right? The answer is more complicated than that, and it is one of the things that makes this corner of media history genuinely interesting to dig into. Television in the late 1990s and early 2000s was produced in a very different environment than it is today. Production companies made decisions about what to archive and what to discard based on cost, storage space, and an industry-wide assumption that reruns and physical media would be the primary ways people revisited content. Nobody was thinking about streaming libraries in 1999. Nobody was anticipating that decades later, a generation of fans would comb through every available source trying to reconstruct scenes that were cut before broadcast. The mindset was that if a scene did not make it to air, it was finished. It had served its purpose in the editing room and could be disposed of. This is why so many deleted scenes from the first 3 seasons of Family Guy exist only as fragments, glimpsed briefly in early promotional material or described in production notes that are themselves hard to locate. The full-color deleted scenes that fans know and trade on DVD extras mostly begin with Season 4, when the revival happened and the production became more conscious of its own archival value. Everything before that, the original run, the era when the show was at its creative peak by most accounts, is a patchwork. Some of it is recoverable, some of it remains genuinely unknown. But the concept of a lost episode in Family Guy is not just about material that was made and then misplaced. It encompasses several distinct categories, and it is worth understanding each of them separately because they have very different characters. The first category is the officially shelved episode. These are completed episodes that a network chose not to air for reasons that usually involved controversy, timing, or political sensitivity. The episode exists. It is finished. It may even be available on DVD or in certain international markets, but for the purposes of the American viewing audience, it was never broadcast. It is a ghost on the schedule. 2 episodes of Family Guy fall clearly into this category, and we will spend significant time with each of them. The second category is the modified episode, specifically episodes that were broadcast in one form and then quietly altered for every subsequent airing or streaming release. The original version becomes, in a practical sense, lost to the majority of viewers who will only ever encounter the edited cut. A specific scene from a Season 2 episode of Family Guy is one of the most significant examples of this in the show's entire history, and the reasons it was removed are inseparable from one of the most significant events of the early 2000s. The third category is the retroactively banned episode. This covers content that aired normally, was seen by millions of people, and was then pulled from rotation after an event in the outside world made its continued broadcast feel inappropriate or irresponsible. One particular episode from Season 11 of Family Guy falls into this category, and the story of how it got pulled is a strange and somewhat unsettling piece of recent media history involving fabricated video, a far-right media figure, and a genuine national tragedy. The fourth category, and the one that carries the most mythology around it, is the creepypasta and the fan theory. This is where reality and imagination start to blur, where documented facts and creative speculation exist in the same space and are not always easy to separate. Family Guy has generated an enormous body of dark fan theories over the years, some of which are clever enough and carefully enough constructed that they feel almost indistinguishable from the real thing on a first reading. These theories are not evidence of actual hidden content, but they do something interesting. They reveal the way fans engage with a show they feel has never fully explained itself, and they sometimes point toward real discontinuities and strange choices in the show's production that are worth taking seriously even if the conclusions are invented. And then there is a fifth category, smaller and less discussed, which is the material that was genuinely intended to exist and never did. Planned episodes that were canceled before production. Story arcs that were outlined in writers' rooms and then abandoned. Characters whose backstories were sketched but never developed. This is the territory of what the show could have been, and it is sometimes more haunting than what was actually made. Tonight, we are going to move through all of these territories. We are going to trace the real history carefully, because the real history is strange enough on its own, and where we step into theory or speculation, it will be clearly marked. Drop a comment letting me know where you are in the world right now and what time it is. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that people are listening to this from completely different corners of the planet, all in the dark. And if this is the kind of content you find yourself gravitating toward, subscribing costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps more of this get made. Part 2. The first missing episode and the long wait when you wish upon a Weinstein. To understand the full context of what happened with Family Guy's first officially suppressed episode, you have to go back to the show's second season, to a production environment that was already under pressure in ways that most viewers at the time had no idea about. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, in one of the best time slots available on American television, the post-Super Bowl broadcast window. The first episode pulled in around 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated show about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family with a talking dog and an evil genius baby, those numbers were remarkable. The first season performed solidly by any reasonable measure, averaging 12.8 million households and landing at number 33 inches the Nielsen ratings that year. But Fox's relationship with the show was already troubled by the time season 2 was in production. The network had a habit of shuffling the show around in the schedule without adequate notice, moving it into time slots where it competed against established, deeply watched programs like Frasier on NBC. The audience had trouble finding the show consistently. The ratings dropped. Fox grew nervous. In this atmosphere of institutional uncertainty, the writers were producing Season 2 content. One of the episodes they developed during this period was a story that centered on Peter Griffin developing what he believed was a genuine cultural insight, that Jewish people were, as a group, exceptionally good at financial matters. The episode followed Peter as he befriends a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, played by Ben Stein, who helps the family recover money they had been cheated out of by a crooked insurance salesman. Peter, processing this experience with his usual lack of nuance, decides that because Max Weinstein helped him with money, the most logical thing he can do for his son Chris is arrange for the boy to convert to Judaism. The episode was titled When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, a pun on the Disney classic When You Wish Upon a Star, and it featured a musical number written by Seth MacFarlane called I Need a Do. The original version of the song included a lyric that Peter sang with the cheerful obliviousness his character was built on. Even though they killed my lord, I need a Jew. The joke was entirely about Peter being ignorant, not sophisticated, not operating from any thoughtful perspective. Peter did not understand his own religion well enough to hold that line with any real conviction. He just knew he had a financial problem and Max had solved it, and he was connecting dots that had no business being connected. Fox's executives saw the episode in post-production and froze. They decided that regardless of the satirical intent, the content carried too much risk. The line about killing the Lord, even coming from a character established as reliably uninformed about everything, felt like something that could generate genuine backlash from Jewish groups and Christian groups simultaneously and from precisely the wrong angles. Fox pulled the episode from its intended December 2000 broadcast slot. It was shelved completely. What makes this particularly interesting from a historical perspective is the trajectory it then took. The episode sat in limbo for nearly 3 years. Family Guy itself was canceled in 2002. The show's reruns began airing on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block starting in April 2003, and that September, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein finally aired for the first time anywhere on Adult Swim, without the Fox network having any direct involvement. The episode aired in a slightly modified form for that Adult Swim broadcast. The contested lyric was changed to "I don't think they killed my lord," which altered the joke's mechanics considerably. McFarlane had recorded an alternate version of the line specifically for broadcast purposes, but he was vocal about preferring the original. He gave what he called a "consider the source" defense, pointing out that the show had established extensively that Peter Griffin was a man of spectacular ignorance across every domain, including his own faith, and that no reasonable viewer could interpret the original line as the show endorsing the sentiment rather than satirizing the person speaking it. The original version of the lyric is interesting in the context of lost content because it exists in a curious half state. If you watched the episode on TBS and you had the closed captions on, the captions would show the original lyric even as the audio played the replacement version. If you watched carefully and read Peter's lip movements, you could see he was saying the original words. The new audio had been dubbed over, but the animators had never redrawn his mouth to match. So the original version was simultaneously visible and inaudible. It occupies this strange zone between present and absent. Fox eventually aired a censored version of the episode in December 2004, after the show had been revived and was building momentum again. By that point, the context of the joke had been largely established for anyone who had seen it on Adult Swim or the DVD release, and the predicted backlash turned out to be much milder than Fox's executives had feared. Several Jewish organizations that were consulted on the episode gave it positive assessments, reading it accurately as a satire of anti-Semitic stereotyping rather than an endorsement of them. But the delay had cost the episode something. There is an early draft of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein that is even more obscure than the final product, a version that represents the episode before it went through the rewrites that produced what eventually aired. The Lost Media Wiki documented the existence of this earlier script in detail following its partial emergence online in 2020, when a Twitter user revealed they had access to a copy and shared images of its pages. That person later converted the script to a PDF and shared it through Google Drive, but the file became unretrievable. The earlier script reportedly contained scenes and lines significantly different from what was eventually produced, representing a version of the episode that has never been seen in any form and may exist now only in the hands of whoever has physical copies. What makes the idea of that earlier draft compelling is not that it necessarily contained something more shocking or more controversial than what was made. The interest is in what it reveals about the creative process. Scripts go through multiple drafts. Whole scenes get written, read aloud in the writer's room, and discarded because they do not work or because they push in a direction the show ultimately decides not to go. In most cases, those early drafts simply stop existing as anything but a memory for the people who were in the room. The fact that an early version of one of Family Guy's most historically significant episodes survived long enough to be partially documented but then slipped back into inaccessibility feels like a very accurate metaphor for this whole area of the show's history. The case of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein established a precedent that would matter enormously a decade later when a second episode ran into network resistance. It showed that Family Guy could produce something that a network considered too risky to air, that the internet and alternative broadcast channels could end up serving as the vehicle for public access to that content, and that the passage of time and the recontextualization of the audience could ultimately diffuse a controversy that had once seemed insurmountable. It also established something about the show's relationship with Fox. McFarlane had agreed to produce the episode with the understanding that Fox retained the right to decline to air it. This was an explicit part of the arrangement, a practical acknowledgement that a network and a creator might have different thresholds for what counted as acceptable content. That arrangement was functional when it was made. It would become significantly more fraught over the years, as the show grew more commercially important, as McFarlane's own public persona became more defined by his political and social views, and as the gap between what the show wanted to say and what the network was willing to broadcast occasionally felt less like a creative tension and more like a genuine institutional conflict. The story of the Weinstein episode also touches on something less often discussed, which is the existence of multiple complete versions of the same content. For most shows, an episode is an episode. It airs. It reruns. The version that people see is the version that exists. But for certain Family Guy episodes, particularly those that got caught between broadcast standards and production intent, there are multiple authentic versions that diverge from each other in meaningful ways. The DVD version may contain the original cut. The broadcast version contains the modified audio. The international version might have yet another configuration. Depending on where and when you watch the show, you might have seen a fundamentally different version of the same episode without any indication that the version you were watching was anything other than the definitive one. This is worth sitting with, because it changes the way you think about an episode as an artifact. The thing you watched is not necessarily the thing the creators made, and in at least some cases, the thing the creators made has been so thoroughly replaced in the mainstream distribution pipeline that it now exists only in the hands of people who specifically sought it out. Part 3. The episode that was never allowed to exist here, partial terms of endearment. In the summer of 2009, at San Diego Comic-Con, the production team for Family Guy announced something unusual. They had made an episode that was not going to air in the United States. Not a scene that had been trimmed. Not a joke that had been muted or blurred. A complete, finished, fully produced episode of television that the Fox network had decided, before it was ever seen by the American public, would not be broadcast. The episode was called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was intended as the finale of Season 8. And the reason it never aired on Fox, and has never aired on Fox to this day, is that its central subject matter is abortion. The episode begins with Lois reconnecting with a college friend named Naomi, who is trying to have a child with her husband. Naomi asks Lois if she would be willing to serve as a surrogate mother. After some resistance from Peter, Lois agrees. The surrogacy proceeds. And then, in the episode's inciting complication, Naomi and her husband are killed in a car accident. Lois is left carrying a fetus with no biological parents living, facing the question of what to do with a pregnancy she entered into on behalf of people who no longer exist to have opinions about it. Peter, through a series of interactions with anti-abortion activists, becomes convinced that Lois must carry the baby to term. Lois, genuinely struggling with the weight of the choice, arrives at her own conclusion by the end of the episode. The episode then cuts to black before revealing what she decided. Seth MacFarlane was characteristically blunt about what he thought of Fox's decision not to air it. He told the New York Times that the episode was pulled because of people's inability to handle and dissect controversial narratives. He speculated, and this is his own observation rather than an established fact, that if the same story had been told on a medical drama like House rather than on a crude animated comedy, it probably would have aired without significant objection. The form of the show was the problem as much as the content. An animated comedy tackling abortion with satirical intent was, in Fox's calculation, a provocation that the network did not want to be associated with regardless of the episode's actual quality. The BBC did not share this concern. In the United Kingdom, BBC Three aired Partial Terms of Endearment on the 20th of June 2010 at 10:30 inches the evening in its regular primetime slot without incident. The episode reached approximately 1 million homes in the UK and received positive reviews. Critics who saw it generally agreed that the episode was one of the more thoughtful pieces the show had produced in years, that it engaged with its subject with more care and nuance than a typical Family Guy episode, and that Fox's refusal to air it said more about the network's institutional risk aversion than it did about the episode's content. The episode is available on the Family Guy Season 8 DVD box set, but with a notable absence from the set's digital editions. As of the time of this script's composition, Partial Terms of Endearment is not available to stream on Hulu, which has otherwise been the comprehensive streaming home for Family Guy's back catalog. The episode exists in a peculiar digital limbo. It can be purchased on physical media. It has been broadcast in several international markets. But the American streaming ecosystem, which is where most people now encounter older television content, has never included it. This creates a genuinely strange situation where the episode is both findable and effectively invisible. Someone who grew up watching Family Guy on Hulu and never went looking for the physical media would have no way of knowing from the platform itself that this episode exists. The episode would simply not be there. Season 8 would seem to end one episode earlier than it does on the DVD. The gap would be invisible unless you knew to look for it. The question of why Hulu does not host the episode is not straightforwardly answered by any official statement. Fox's request that Adult Swim not air the episode after Fox declined to broadcast, it suggests an institutional preference that extends beyond just the original broadcast decision, a preference for the episode not to be widely seen in the American market in any form. That preference appears to have carried forward into the streaming era, or at least nobody involved has pushed hard enough to change it. What is interesting about partial terms of endearment in the context of this broader conversation is what it represents as a piece of production history. The episode exists, it is finished. The voice work is recorded, the animation is complete, the music is in place. Every element that constitutes an episode of television is there. And yet for a meaningful portion of the show's audience, in the country where the show was made and is most associated with, it is effectively a ghost. The theories that circulate around the episode are less elaborate than those around some other Family Guy content, because the story of its suppression is relatively transparent. There is not much mystery about why it was pulled, but there is a certain melancholy to the idea of a completed piece of creative work that was deemed too dangerous for its intended audience, that was allowed to exist elsewhere in the world, and that has never been fully allowed to exist in the place it was made. McFarlane's reaction to the ban was also telling. He was not quietly accepting of it. He was publicly critical and visibly frustrated. This was not a creator shrugging and moving on. It was a creator who believed in the episode and found the network's decision both cowardly and intellectually insulting. The tension between that creative frustration and the commercial reality of his relationship with Fox would become a recurring theme in the show's later history, reaching a point where McFarlane would eventually describe his continued association with the network as resembling a failing marriage. There is something worth lingering on in that framing. The creator of one of the most commercially valuable animated franchises in the history of American television, describing his relationship with the network airing that franchise as a marriage in which both parties knew it was not working anymore. The show continued. The episodes kept getting made. But the spirit that had animated the project in its early years was housed somewhere else entirely, and both sides of the relationship knew it. Part 4. The Real Pilot and What Was Lost in the Beginning. In March of 2025, something happened that the community of people who track lost media had been hoping would happen for almost 3 decades. The original 1998 pitch pilot for Family Guy surfaced online in its complete form. This requires some explaining, because the word pilot in the context of Family Guy has been somewhat confusing for fans over the years. What most people think of as the Family Guy pilot is the first broadcast episode, Death Has a Shadow, which aired on the 31st of January 1999. But before that episode was produced, McFarlane had made a separate 16-minute film specifically to pitch the show to Fox. This earlier piece was made in 1998, and it was the thing that convinced Fox to greenlight the series. The pitch pilot was not the same as the broadcast pilot. It had different animation quality, different character designs in a number of ways, different scene configurations, and multiple moments that were either reworked or discarded entirely before the series went into production. It was, in essence, a rough draft of what Family Guy would become, made by one person working largely out of his own home, with a budget that Fox reportedly set at around $50,000 at a time when a typical half-hour animated pilot cost closer to $1 million. For most of the show's history, only the first 7 minutes of this pitch pilot were known to exist in accessible form. Those 7 minutes had been included as bonus content on the Family Guy Volume 2 DVD set released in September 2003. Fans had been aware for years that the rest of the pilot was out there somewhere, but no complete version had surfaced. The Lost Media Wiki tracked the status of the full pilot for years under the category of sought-after content. Then, on the 20th of March 2025, a user named Ghost the Dead Girl discovered that the entire 16-minute pilot was hosted on the personal portfolio website of Robert Paulson, an animator who had been part of the original production team. Paulson's site had apparently been there the whole time, accessible to anyone who knew to look, but nobody had connected the dots until that moment. The discovery spread through the lost media community quickly. The full pilot was documented, archived, and became publicly available. What the full pilot reveals is a version of Family Guy at its earliest, most unformed state. The characters are recognizable, but not quite themselves yet. The animation has a rougher, more experimental quality that you do not see in even the first broadcast season. Certain gags appear in proto-form, sketched out in ways that suggest McFarlane was still finding the rhythms that would define the show's comedy. It is the kind of document that is more interesting as a piece of creative history than as entertainment, though it is certainly entertaining in its own right. But the recovery of the pitch pilot only deepened the awareness of everything that remained genuinely absent. The Lost Media Wiki's documentation of Family Guy's missing content describes what it calls partially found deleted scenes from seasons 1 through 3, material that is known to exist based on evidence in promotional materials and production records but has never been publicly released. The nature of this gap is significant. Starting from season 4 onward, Family Guy DVD releases routinely included full-color deleted scenes as bonus content. The practice of archiving this material became standard once the show was revived, and the production understood that fans valued it. But for the first 3 seasons, the period that most fans consider the show's creative peak, no equivalent archive was created. The deleted scenes from those years were not packaged into DVD extras. They were not assembled and released in any form. 2 specific clips from the first season have been documented through early promotional material. A scene where Chris tells Peter he is going to get drunk, and Peter responds with practical parenting advice, and an alternate version of a scene from the second episode where Peter shoots at the children of the corn. Both clips have been confirmed to exist based on their appearance in 1999 promotional advertising. Neither has been released in complete form as part of any official home media package. The question of what else exists from this period, in the form of completed deleted scenes that were cut from episodes before air, is genuinely unanswerable from the outside. Production companies hold archival material in various states of organization and accessibility, and there is no mechanism by which a fan or researcher can simply request an inventory of what survives from a show's early production. What has not been released may be stored somewhere. It may have been lost in the transitions between production companies or during the turbulent period of the show's 2 cancellations and subsequent revival. It may have been routinely discarded as worthless. There is simply no way to know. What this means practically is that the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, despite being the most studied and celebrated portion of the show, are also the portion about which the least complete information exists in terms of what was made but not seen. The golden era of the show is also, in terms of archival completeness, the darkest. Part 5. Road to Rhode Island and the Scene That Stopped Existing. Of all the pieces of Family Guy content that have been removed from the show's standard distribution and remain difficult to access in the United States, one specific scene carries more weight than almost any other. Not because it is shocking by contemporary standards, not because of what it contains in isolation, but because of the extraordinary convergence of circumstances that made it impossible to leave in place. The episode is Road to Rhode Island, from Season 2. It originally aired on the 30th of May, 2000. The episode is generally considered one of the best Family Guy episodes ever produced. Seth MacFarlane has called it his favorite episode of the show. The cast and crew have repeatedly cited it as a creative high point. It was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program and lost only to a Simpsons episode called Behind the Laughter. Among fans who rank episodes, it consistently appears near or at the top of any list. The episode follows Brian and Stewie on a cross-country trip after Brian is supposed to pick Stewie up from his grandparents' house in Palm Springs. Brian gets drunk at the airport bar, causing the 2 of them to miss their connecting flight, and the episode becomes their long journey home together, establishing the Brian and Stewie dynamic that would define some of the show's best work in subsequent years. There is a musical number. There is a touching scene involving Brian's mother. The episode has more emotional substance than most of what Family Guy produced in any era. In the original broadcast version, there is a scene at an airport security checkpoint. Stewie, who, as usual, is carrying an assortment of weapons and destructive devices, needs to get them through the X-ray machine without being detected. He distracts the security officer by singing "On the Good Ship Lollipop," a children's song, performing it with enough theatrical commitment that nobody looks at the screen. After he passes through, he remarks something to the effect of, "Let's hope Osama bin Laden does not know any show tunes." The camera then cuts to another security line, where Osama bin Laden is attempting the same technique, singing a song from the musical A Chorus Line. The scene was written and animated in 1999 or early 2000. It aired on the 30th of May 2000. At the time of its airing, Osama bin Laden was a known figure in the context of terrorism and the 1,998 embassy bombings, but had not yet become the defining face of global terror that he would become after the 11th of September 2001. The joke read as a topical reference to a known villain rather than a prediction or a commentary on anything that had happened or was about to happen. Then September 11th occurred, and everything about that scene's context changed immediately and irreversibly. The reason it changed so completely is a fact that, if you are hearing it for the first time, tends to stop you cold. Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of the 11th of September 2001. That is the flight that was hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 inches the morning. MacFarlane did not board the flight. The story of why he did not is one he has told in multiple interviews over the years, and it involves two independent things going wrong at the same time. His travel agent had given him an incorrect departure time, telling him the flight left at 8:15 when the actual departure was 7:45. And MacFarlane had been up late the night before in Rhode Island, where he had given a lecture at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, and had gone out for drinks afterward. He arrived at Logan International Airport hungover and running late, went to the counter, and was told the gate had already closed. He was too late to board. He went to the airport lounge, fell asleep, and woke up approximately 45 minutes later to commotion. The television was showing footage of the World Trade Center. The flight he had missed, the one he had been too late to board by approximately 10 minutes, had hit the North Tower. Everyone on board was dead. MacFarlane's assistant had received a message saying he had missed his flight and would be taking a later one, but the message did not arrive until around 20 minutes after the attacks, by which point people close to him were already assuming he had been on Flight 11. What the Bin Laden airport scene in Road to Rhode Island means in light of this is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind. An animated show, created by a man who narrowly survived one of the defining catastrophes of the 21st century by arriving drunk and late to an airport, had aired an episode the previous year in which Osama bin Laden danced through airport security. The scene had been a throwaway joke. After September 11th, it was something else entirely, and there was no way to let it remain in the standard version of the episode. The scene was cut from syndication and from the initial DVD releases. The Family Guy Volume 1 DVD set, which covered the first 2 seasons, did not include the original version of the scene. For a period of years, the scene effectively did not exist in any widely accessible form. It did eventually surface. The Family Guy, the Freakin' Sweet Collection, a later DVD compilation, restored the original scene. The iTunes download version and the Hulu version apparently also include it. The UK DVD release kept it intact from the beginning. So, the scene is not truly lost in the way that some other Family Guy content is lost, but it occupied a state of suppression for long enough, and the circumstances around it are unusual enough that it belongs in any serious account of the show's relationship with its own history. The broader significance of the scene in the context of MacFarlane and 9/11 does not stop with Road to Rhode Island. MacFarlane was not done with the subject. He did not treat September 11th as something his show was required to avoid. He went back to it multiple times, in increasingly direct ways, and the show's engagement with that event is one of the more complex and sometimes unsettling threads running through its later seasons. Part 6. The Boston Marathon, the fabricated video, and the retroactive erasure. There is a category of content that gets removed from distribution not because of what it was originally, but because of how the outside world changed around it. This is a different kind of loss from the deliberate suppression of an episode before it airs, or the quiet editing of a scene that became uncomfortable after a historical event. This category involves a show that found itself, through no act of planning, appearing to be connected to a real catastrophe in a way that made its continued availability feel actively harmful. The episode Turban Cowboy is the 15th episode of Season 11 of Family Guy. It originally aired on the 17th of March, 2013. It is not a particularly celebrated episode, Reviews at the time were poor. The AV Club gave it a D, noting that it felt like something produced in 2002 and left on a shelf, failing to engage with contemporary nuance in its portrayal of a Muslim character who turns out, despite the show's initial attempt at a critique of Islamophobia, a D, to be an actual terrorist. The setup was clumsy. The satire, if it was intended as satire, did not land. The episode contained two separate scenes involving violence that would become significant. The first was a cutaway in which Peter wins the Boston Marathon by driving a car through the crowd of runners, mowing down competitors in what was presented as an absurdist gag about Peter's approach to competition. The second was a scene involving a bridge bombing, part of the episode's main plot. On the 15th of April, 2013, a month after the episode aired, two terrorists detonated homemade pressure cooker bombs at the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, an edited video appeared on YouTube. Whoever made it had taken the car through the crowd scene from Turban Cowboy and edited it together with a scene from the episode's main plot involving a phone-triggered explosion. The resulting clip made it appear as though a single, continuous sequence was depicting a bombing at the Boston Marathon. The edit was fraudulent. The two scenes in the episode had nothing to do with each other and appeared in completely different contexts. But the assembled clip spread rapidly, partly because of how convincingly it could be presented to someone who had not seen the episode and did not know what they were looking at. Alex Jones, the broadcaster and conspiracy theorist, amplified the clip and suggested that Family Guy had predicted, or possibly inspired, the bombing. Jones had built his media presence on exactly this kind of connection making, and the fabricated clip gave him a ready-made piece of material to work with. The claim that the episode had somehow foreseen or encouraged the attack spread through the same information channels that conspiracy content always travels through, and it reached enough people quickly enough that Fox felt the need to act. Fox pulled Turban Cowboy from Hulu and Fox.com. The network stated it had no immediate plans to re-air the episode. Seth MacFarlane took to social media to push back against the fabricated video, explicitly calling it a hoax and describing the edit as dishonest. But the damage in terms of the episode's reputation and accessibility was already done. The episode was removed from rotation. It remained in a complicated state of availability for years after that. It was included on DVDs. Cable reruns eventually brought it back to certain markets. But Hulu, which became the primary streaming home for the show's back catalog, did not restore Turban Cowboy until September 2022, more than 9 years after the bombing. Even after restoration in the United States, the episode remained unavailable on Disney Plus in the American market, though it could be accessed through the Star add-on to Disney Plus outside of the US. What is worth understanding about the Turban Cowboy case is the mechanism by which it became lost. It was not suppressed because of its actual content in isolation. The episode itself, however poorly reviewed, had aired without incident on its original broadcast date. It was the combination of the episode existing, a subsequent real-world event creating a specific kind of sensitivity, and a deliberate act of fraudulent editing by an unknown third party that produced the conditions under which the content was removed. The show became a victim of someone else's manipulation of its own material. This raises a question worth sitting with. If any episode of any show could be made to appear to predict or inspire a subsequent real-world event through selective editing and strategic misrepresentation, then the vulnerability of media content to this kind of retroactive recontextualization is essentially limitless. The fabricated video worked because people who did not know the show, who had no context for the cutaway structure of Family Guy or the unrelated nature of the two scenes, looked at the assembled clip and saw something that appeared genuinely disturbing. The fake had enough surface plausibility to require explicit debunking rather than being obviously wrong on its face. The episode that got erased from streaming availability for nearly a decade was erased not because of what it was, but because of what someone made it appear to be. That is a specific kind of loss, one that does not fit neatly into any of the usual categories, and it raises questions about the fragility of media provenance that go well beyond Family Guy specifically. Part 7. Back to the pilot and the strange weight of a date. There is an episode of Family Guy that aired on the 13th of November 2011 that carries a specific gravity because of when it aired and what it was about. The episode is called Back to the Pilot, and it is one of the show's more ambitious time travel stories, featuring Brian and Stewie using Stewie's time machine to return to January 31st, 1999, the night the very first episode of Family Guy broadcast. The episode is in some ways a love letter to the show's own history, and in other ways a complicated act of self-criticism. When Brian and Stewie arrive in 1999, they find the Griffin family frozen in place, paused mid-action during what should be a cutaway gag, doing nothing, waiting. The joke is that the characters have no existence during the cutaways. They are just stopped, motionless, until the random disconnected joke finishes and the main story resumes. It was the show openly acknowledging a structural critique that critics had been making for years. But the episode's main plot involves Brian, while in 1999, telling his past self about the September 11th attacks. The logic is that Brian could save thousands of lives by warning people before the hijackings happen. What follows in the episode is a cascade of unintended consequences. The prevented attacks lead to George W. Bush losing the 2004 election, and without the political environment created by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a different chain of events produces a second American Civil War, and ultimately an irradiated wasteland. The episode aired on the 13th of November 2011. The 11th of September 2011. The 10th anniversary of the attacks had been 2 months earlier. The choice to air an episode explicitly about preventing September 11th 2 months after the national commemoration of the event's 10th anniversary was not, by any reasonable interpretation, accidental timing. The episode ends with multiple versions of Brian and Stewie voting on whether to allow the attacks to happen, and the decision to let them proceed carries a high five. The line, "We did it, Brian. We made 9/11 happen," became one of the more discussed and criticized moments from the later seasons of the show. The intent was satirical, and the episode's argument that preventing 9/11 would have had unforeseen consequences that led to something worse was making a point about the limits of historical counterfactuals and the specifically American political uses of the attacks. But the delivery was jarring enough, and the framing irreverent enough, that it generated significant viewer backlash. What connects this to the broader territory of McFarlane's personal relationship with September 11th is the fact that the episode's creator had been booked on American Airlines Flight 11. He had watched the consequences of that event unfold from an airport lounge, understanding in real time that if his agent had given him the correct departure time, he would have been on that plane. Family Guy's engagement with 9/11, from the Bin Laden airport scene that preceded the attacks to the retroactive awareness that colored every subsequent reference, is not just a show making edgy jokes about a sensitive topic. It is a creator working through something in public, in a medium that has always been his primary way of processing the world, using the tools available to him. There is a fan theory, documented and discussed in multiple places, that the Family Guy film Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story, released in 2005 shortly after the show's revival, was understood by some viewers as an allegory for McFarlane's experience of surviving September 11th. The theory holds that the film's themes of Stewie confronting his own mortality and grappling with questions of identity and survival encode something of what McFarlane was working through as someone who had narrowly missed being on Flight 11. This is speculation, and McFarlane has not confirmed any such reading, but it is the kind of interpretive framework that fans construct when they believe a creator is putting personal material into work that is ostensibly about something else entirely. Part 8. The dark theory that rewrites the whole show. In August of 2012, a user named bblank0308 posted a piece of writing to the Reddit community fan theories that would eventually become one of the most widely shared and discussed fan theories in the history of animated television. The post began with a question. Have you ever wondered how the Griffin family manages to get into every kind of impossible situation, from battles with giant chickens to full-scale alien invasions, without any of it having real consequences? Why does nothing stick? Why does everything reset? The answer the theory proposed was this: none of it is real. The world of Family Guy exists entirely inside the mind of Peter Griffin, who is in a mental institution. Peter went insane after his entire family died, and the show we watch is the elaborate, internally consistent hallucination of a grieving man who cannot accept what happened to the people he loved. The theory's construction of events is specific and relatively internally coherent. It proposes that in the real world, Meg Griffin was not the awkward, unpopular girl the show depicts. She was beautiful and popular, the kind of teenager who drew positive attention wherever she went. Chris Griffin, in this version of the story, was born with an intellectual disability caused by oxygen deprivation at birth. Meg had a deep bond with her brother, a protective love for him, and one night she took him to a party. She had been drinking. On the way home, she crashed the car. Both Meg and Chris died. Lois, unable to process the loss of two of her children, committed suicide while pregnant with the baby who would have been Stewie. Peter, who had already been told he was going to have a son, had already chosen a name. He had never met the child. He knew him only as potential. Unable to survive the loss of his entire family, Peter collapsed into madness. He was institutionalized. And inside the institution, inside the fractured processing of a destroyed mind trying to rebuild the world into something survivable, he constructed a place where everyone was still alive. A house in Rhode Island. A wife who played piano. 3 children who drove him crazy in the ways that children are supposed to drive you crazy. A talking dog with intellectual pretensions. And a baby who was secretly brilliant and secretly dangerous. Because the unborn child that Peter never got to meet had always, in Peter's imagining, been capable of more than the world would have given him room for. In the theory, the reason Meg is treated so badly throughout the show is that Peter's love for her is contaminated by his knowledge, even buried and subconscious, of what happened. He still loves her in flashes. There are moments of genuine warmth between Peter and Meg, scattered through the show's run, that the theory reads as the real Peter surfacing briefly through the psychosis. But mostly he resents her, because somewhere beneath the hallucination he knows she was driving. Stewie's desire to kill Lois, in the theory's framework, is Peter's subconscious anger at Lois for taking her own life, for leaving him. The evil genius baby who wants to murder his mother is a projection of grief onto the child that Peter imagined having. Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe are, in this version, Peter's real friends in the outside world, visiting him in the institution. Their appearances in the show represent those visits, translated into the hallucination's logic. Cleveland eventually stops visiting, which is why he gets his own spin-off show inside Peter's head. Peter constructs a whole separate reality for Cleveland, because Cleveland leaving was another loss he could not metabolize. The theory went viral on Reddit and returned to cultural prominence in 2022 when TikTok users began discovering it and sharing it with commentary, encouraging others to look it up at night with the warning that it was disturbing and would change how you watch the show. The description was not wrong. Once you have read the theory, it is genuinely difficult to watch certain scenes, particularly the scenes of Meg's abuse or the moments of unexpected warmth between characters, without the framework intruding. What makes this theory interesting beyond its narrative cleverness is what it identifies about the show's actual structure. The theory exists because the show's internal logic genuinely has gaps in it. A man with no steady employment and minimal skills maintains a comfortable home in what appears to be a nice neighborhood. Characters survive catastrophic physical damage that should be lethal and appear fine the next episode. Story developments that seem to carry weight for the characters involved are simply forgotten. The world of the show operates by rules that resemble reality but do not actually match it. There are mundane explanations for all of these things. Animated comedies routinely bend the rules of consequence for comedic purposes. The lack of continuity is a deliberate structural choice that allows the writers to tell whatever story they want in any given episode without being bound by what came before. None of these anomalies require the explanation that the show is Peter's hallucination. But the theory does something that simple explanations cannot, which is give those anomalies emotional weight. When the story of the show is that nothing is real because the real story is too painful to tell, the reset button stops being a lazy writing convention and becomes a symptom. The way Meg is treated stops being a running joke that went too far and becomes a crack in the hallucination through which Peter's real feelings leak out. The show stops being a cartoon that cannot decide how dark it wants to be and becomes the portrait of a man for whom darkness is the only truth. Whether this was what McFarlane and the writers intended is unknowable and probably irrelevant, The theory works as a theory because the show supports it, not because anyone planted it there deliberately. It is a reader bringing meaning to a text, which is a fundamentally different thing from the text encoding that meaning. But the fact that the show supports the reading at all is a reflection of something real about the way the show is constructed. The inconsistency, the cruelty that occasionally surfaces, the flashes of genuine warmth that seem at odds with the show's dominant tone. The theory has become so widespread that it now functions almost as a canonical alternative reading of the show in certain fan communities. It is discussed not as a crazy idea, but as a legitimate interpretive lens. And it has generated secondary theories that build on its foundation, exploring specific episodes or character moments through the framework it established. Part 9. Stewie's Voice, the original recording, and what changed. The character of Stewie Griffin is, in terms of pop culture impact, probably the single most recognizable creation in Family Guy's history. The baby in the yellow shirt with the British accent, the ray gun, the sinister monologues. In the early seasons, Stewie's voice and manner were built on a specific model. The theatrical villain, the patrician menace, something like Rex Harrison crossed with a Bond antagonist. The voice carried absolute confidence. It communicated intelligence as a form of aggression. What many people do not know is that the voice in those early seasons was also somewhat different from what it would become. The evolution of Stewie's voice over the show's run is subtle but real, and it was intentional. MacFarlane has discussed in various interviews that the character shifted not just in personality, but in vocal quality. As the seasons progressed, moving towards something slightly more accessible, slightly less purely theatrical. The implications of this for the lost media conversation are interesting in a specific way. There exist original recordings from early production sessions, from the pilot era and the first season, where Stewie sounds slightly different from what most viewers associate with the character. The recordings that survive from that period have a quality that is harder to place, something in the enunciation or the register that is a few degrees more extreme than what the character settled into. The fully realized Stewie of the second and third seasons, the one that fans of the original era remember most vividly, is already slightly softer than the Stewie of the pitch pilot. And the Stewie of the later seasons is softer still, eventually abandoning much of the theatrical villain quality altogether in favor of emotional vulnerability and comedy, arising from identity and insecurity rather than from menace. This creates a layering effect where multiple distinct versions of the character exist in the audio record, some of them accessible and some of them not. The earliest recordings from the pitch pilot that was considered lost media until March 2025 contained the most extreme version of what Stewie was supposed to sound like before the character found his final form. Within those recordings, there is something worth hearing. Not because the character is better or worse than he became, but because you can hear the process of a creator figuring out who a character is. There is a specific piece of content from the Season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois, and Lois Kills Stewie, that belongs in this conversation. During production of those episodes, a musical number was written and recorded for a scene in the second part of the story, in which Stewie, having taken over the world and installed himself as its ruler, delivers a speech that was originally intended to include a song. The song was called The List, and it detailed, in Stewie's voice, all the categories of people who would not be missed under his new regime, who would be made examples of, who would not survive the new order. The song was cut from the final broadcast version of the episode. The official reason given was that cutting it was a matter of runtime, that the episode was running long and something had to go. The song exists, documented in television databases including the TV database, which lists it as a deleted musical number with an original air date of November 11th, 2007 that corresponds to when Lois Kills Stewie broadcast. It is listed as unaired content from those episodes. The content of the song, based on descriptions from people with access to production materials, was apparently detailed enough in its list of targets that the runtime explanation, while likely true, may also have been compounded by content considerations. An evil baby enumerating in song the classes of people he planned to eliminate or make examples of might have been something that even Family Guy's Standards and Practices review felt warranted removal for reasons beyond the clock. The song's existence in that half-documented, confirmed but unaired state is precisely the kind of thing that generates speculation. It is known to have been recorded. It exists somewhere in the production archive. It has never been released as a deleted scene or a DVD extra or any form of bonus content. The fact that it is absent from the standard archival release of this material while the DVD releases for other episodes from the same era routinely include deleted content makes its absence more notable rather than less. Part 10. The Conspiracy of Brian's Death and What Was Really Happening. In November of 2013, Family Guy did something that, at the time, felt genuinely earth-shaking in terms of its implications for a long-running animated show. It killed Brian Griffin. The episode was called Life of Brian, and it aired on the 24th of November, 2013. Brian was killed by a car. The scene was played with unusual emotional sincerity. The Griffin family gathered around him as he died. Stewie held him. Brian said goodbye. The family was devastated. Brian Griffin, who had been part of the show since its very first episode and was voiced by McFarlane himself, was gone. The response was extraordinary. The death of Brian Griffin became national news. It trended on social media for days. Petitions were launched asking Fox to bring him back. Fan communities split between people who were genuinely grieving the character and people who were convinced this could not possibly be permanent. 2 episodes later, on the 15th of December, 2013, Christmas Guy aired. In this episode, Stewie uses a time travel device to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car. Brian was alive again. Everything reset. McFarlane tweeted the day after the resurrection aired. "I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you? Jesus, we'd have to be King high." The reaction to the resurrection was, in many quarters, more negative than the reaction to the death had been. The prevailing sentiment was that the audience had been manipulated. The death had never been a genuine creative decision. It had been a ratings play, a way to generate the kind of passionate audience engagement that a show in its 12th season struggled to produce through normal story development. The grief had been manufactured. The emotional investment had been exploited. Several layers of theory grew around this event in its immediate aftermath, and some of them have remained in circulation because they touch on something genuine about how the show was being managed at that point in its run. The first layer is the straightforward manipulation theory, which holds simply that the death was planned as a temporary event from the beginning, that the production team knew they were going to bring Brian back before they ever aired the episode in which he died, and that the public grieving was a calculated media strategy. This theory is almost certainly true, or at least mostly true. The speed with which the resurrection aired, just 2 episodes later, suggests that the production of the return episode was already underway or completed before the death episode even broadcast. These things take months to produce. The timeline does not support the interpretation that the network responded to audience grief by quickly deciding to reverse the decision. The second layer, which is more interesting, concerns what this event revealed about the show's relationship with consequences. One of the most consistent criticisms of Family Guy in its later seasons was that nothing the show did actually meant anything, because the reset button was always available. Character developments were undone. Emotional moments were followed by episodes that behaved as though they had never happened. The death and resurrection of Brian is the most dramatic possible version of this pattern. The show escalated its own tendency toward consequence-free storytelling, to the point of killing and resurrecting a primary character within 3 broadcast weeks. The third layer involves the actual production timeline and the question of what the writers intended the death to achieve, beyond a rating spike. There is a version of the theory that argues the death was a genuine attempt to shake up the show, to demonstrate that it was capable of something irreversible, to create the kind of meaningful change that would refresh the creative environment. In this version, the resurrection was not the original plan but a concession to the reaction, a decision made under pressure from the audience, from the network, from the commercial realities of what Brian meant to the show's identity and merchandise revenue. This third version is more sympathetic to the production team, but also, if true, somewhat more troubling. It would mean that the show attempted genuine artistic risk, was met with such significant resistance that the risk was immediately walked back, and the public reading of the whole event as a cynical manipulation was actually closer to a description of the outcome than of the intent. Brian came back. He continued to exist in the show, changed in some ways and unchanged in others. The episode Christmas Guy, in which Stewie's love for Brian motivates one of the show's more genuinely affecting emotional moments, is often cited as one of the few truly good episodes from the later seasons. The mechanics of Brian's death and return are inseparable from that episode's emotional texture. You cannot feel the weight of Stewie's sacrifice without knowing what had happened 3 episodes earlier. What was lost in the Brian death and resurrection arc is harder to define than a deleted scene or a banned episode. What was lost was a degree of audience trust. The willingness to take the show's emotional stakes seriously, which is already a complicated ask for a show that built its reputation on refusing to take anything seriously, diminished after November 2000, and 13 Inches Away that did not fully recover. Viewers who had cried or felt genuine loss at Brian's death, and who then watched McFarlane's tweet and the swift reversal of the storytelling, felt something specific and not easily described. Something like the particular embarrassment of having believed in something that turned out to have been designed specifically to make you believe in it. Part 11. The strange archive of things that almost were. There is a category of missing Family Guy content that is different from deleted scenes or banned episodes or retroactively suppressed material. This category is the content that was planned and then abandoned before it was ever made, that exists as intention and outline rather than as footage. The history of what almost got made in any long-running television show is usually invisible to the outside world. Writers' rooms generate ideas that never become scripts. Scripts get written and are never ordered to production. Stories get outlined in detail and then dropped when the room pivots in a different direction. This is the normal metabolism of a show, and very little of it leaves traces that are publicly accessible. For Family Guy, some of this material has surfaced through DVD commentaries, interviews, and online discussions from writers and producers who worked on the show. It forms a picture of a project that was, particularly in its early years, generating more ideas than it could use, and that shed some of those ideas in ways that might have changed the show's character significantly had they been pursued. One of the more discussed examples involves the character of Meg. In the early seasons, as documented in various production discussions, there were story ideas being developed that would have given Meg a more substantial and complex interior life. The character was understood by the writers as potentially having the most genuinely dramatic story of anyone in the family. A teenager who was smarter and more perceptive than anyone around her gave her credit for, navigating the specific loneliness of being the most human person in a house full of exaggerated archetypes. Some of the early Season 3 and early Season 4 story outlines reportedly explored Meg's perspective in ways that gave her genuine agency and intelligence. Those storylines were largely abandoned as the show moved in the direction of using Meg primarily as a target for abuse-based comedy. The reasons for that shift are not fully documented, but the trajectory is clear from the episodes themselves. The potential dramatic version of Meg, the character who could have provided the show with a genuinely grounded emotional center, was left as an outline in a writer's room conversation and never made it to screen. The planned episodes that were never produced include, based on various accounts from people associated with the show, several that would have explored the backstory of characters like Quagmire and Joe Swanson in considerably more depth than the show eventually managed. Quagmire's history was outlined in ways that went beyond what the show eventually revealed, reportedly including material about his relationship with his family of origin that would have complicated the comedy character considerably. Whether this material exists in any written form outside of the memory of the people who were in those rooms is impossible to determine. The show's relationship with its own history is also a source of planned but abandoned content in a different sense. There were apparently discussions in the writers' rooms of later seasons about structural changes to the show, changes to the way it handled continuity, to whether it would commit to developing characters in ways that persisted across episodes, to whether the reset button approach to storytelling could be modified without destroying what the show fundamentally was. These discussions, by most accounts, did not result in meaningful changes to the show's approach. The ideas were generated and then set aside. The pitch pilot that was lost for nearly 30 years and recovered in March 2025 is interesting, partly because of what it shows about content that was made, briefly existed, and then was effectively abandoned. The pilot contains several scenes and moments that were developed with care and then either reworked significantly or discarded entirely in the transition to the broadcast series. Watching it now, knowing what the show became, you can identify the points at which McFarlane was still finding his way, still exploring who these characters were and what the show's register would be. Some of those explorations led somewhere. Others ended at the pitch pilot and were never pursued again. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A creator spending 6 months animating a show by hand in his home, working from a $50,000 budget in an era when that kind of project normally required 20 times as much money, building something from the very specific materials of his own imagination, and in the process generating content that would not survive into the show's final form. The pitch pilot was made to convince a network to fund a series. It worked. And in working, it made itself obsolete. The thing that got Family Guy made was immediately superseded by the thing Family Guy became. Part 12. What endures and what the silence contains. There is a subset of Family Guy fan discussion that operates less as entertainment and more as archaeology. These are the people who scour early broadcast recordings for differences from the currently available versions of episodes, who compare the dialogue and DVD commentaries against what appears in the broadcast cuts, who look for evidence of scenes that ran in early airings of episodes and were then cut for syndication, who map the discrepancies between international versions and domestic ones. This kind of work produces, over time, a map of a show that is considerably more complex than it appears on the surface. Most viewers experience Family Guy as a static archive, a body of episodes that exists in a definitive form. The archaeology of the show reveals instead something more like a living document, one that has been altered and modified and redacted at numerous points, often for reasons that were never publicly explained, sometimes for reasons that can be inferred from context, and sometimes for reasons that remain genuinely unclear. The Bin Laden airport scene in Road to Rhode Island is the most famous example of a modification made for obvious reasons. But there are others scattered throughout the show's history. Episodes that contain topical references have sometimes been modified for syndication when those references became dated or awkward. Jokes that relied on the existence of public figures who were later implicated in misconduct have occasionally been trimmed. Sound effects and background elements have been altered between versions. Some of these changes are trivial. Some represent meaningful differences in what the show is saying or what the moment communicates. The cumulative effect of tracking all of them is to understand that the show you watch on streaming today is in some cases a curated version of the show that aired, rather than the show that aired, and that the curation has happened without announcement or documentation in any form accessible to the ordinary viewer. This is not unique to Family Guy. It is characteristic of a particular era of television, when shows existed primarily as broadcasts and physical media, before the archival imperative of digital streaming created a different relationship with preservation. But Family Guy's specific combination of political and social content, its willingness to engage with real events and real people, and the specific post, 9/11 context in which it produced so much of its most discussed material, makes the pattern of modifications more significant here than it might be for a show working in less directly topical territory. The conspiracy theories that circulate around this territory are, almost without exception, more elaborate than the reality warrants. The documented reality of what Family Guy has suppressed, modified, and lost is strange enough without embellishment. The show has 2 episodes that have never aired in the United States on broadcast television. It has a scene that was removed from the standard version of one of its most acclaimed episodes because of the impossible circumstances surrounding its creator's near death on September 11th. It has an episode that was pulled from streaming for nearly a decade because a fabricated video made it appear to be connected to a mass casualty event. It has a complete body of deleted scenes from its most creatively acclaimed seasons that was never archived for public release. It has a founding document, the original pitch pilot, that was considered lost media for almost 30 years. All of that is true. All of it is documented. And it is more interesting, taken together, than any of the invented elaborations. The theories that push beyond the documented territory, that argue for hidden messages or deliberate predictive content, or coordination with events that nobody could have planned for, are a response to something real even when the specifics are invented. They are a response to the feeling that a show this weird, this willing to go places other shows would not go, this deeply embedded in the public life of a particular cultural era, must contain more than it shows on the surface. That there must be layers. That what you see cannot be the whole thing. That instinct is not entirely wrong. The layers are real. They are just different from the ones the theories describe. Part 13, The Suppressed Song and the Season 6 Aftermath. The Season 6 two-parter that featured Stewie finally killing Lois and then, in the second episode, being defeated by his mother in a confrontation inside the White House, is one of the most structurally ambitious things the show attempted in its post-revival run. The episodes are dramatically coherent in a way that most Family Guy episodes are not. They build to genuine stakes, and they pay off the central promise of the show's early seasons with a degree of commitment that fans had not seen since the original run. The episodes were also the site of specific choices about what to include and what to leave out that left permanent traces in the show's history. The musical number that was cut from the second episode, the one cataloged as The List and documented as a deleted piece of the November 2007 broadcast, was not the only thing removed from this two-parter before it reached audiences. The episodes as broadcast are notably tighter than some of the earlier two-part productions, and the commentary on the DVD release touches on multiple scenes that were written and animated but did not survive to final cut. The nature of what was removed matters for a specific reason. The Season 6 two-parter was the last time the show made a serious attempt to engage with what Stewie had been in the original seasons, the genuine threat, the character for whom world domination and matricide were not comic exaggerations, but actual goals, pursued with real competence. After these episodes, that version of Stewie was effectively retired. The writers made the calculation that the evil baby routine had been exhausted, that they had taken that concept as far as it would go, and that the character needed to move in a different direction. This means that the deleted content from these episodes represents the last substantial creative engagement with the original Stewie before his transformation into the softer, more emotionally vulnerable character of the later seasons. Whatever was cut from those episodes, whatever ran too long or felt too dark or did not make the structural cut, is the last material generated by the show's engagement with its most original character in his original form. The song The List is interesting in this context specifically because of what it was about. A piece of music in which an evil baby, having achieved world domination, enumerates the people who will not survive his new order is thematically perfect for the version of Stewie that existed in the early seasons. It is exactly the kind of thing the character would do. The fact that it was written, recorded, animated, and then cut before broadcast means it was both made and unmade, both expressed and withheld. It exists in the production archive as the clearest possible artifact of a creative direction that was abandoned. Part 14, The Question of What Still Exists, Somewhere. The conversation about lost Family Guy content inevitably arrives at a question that cannot be fully answered. What is still out there, in physical storage or digital archive, that has never been publicly seen? The production history of Family Guy covers more than 25 years and more than 400 episodes. Each episode goes through multiple stages of production, each of which generates material that may or may not survive into the final cut. Writers' room discussions generate scripts that are revised, sometimes radically. Scripts are recorded, and the recordings produce takes that are selected from, and the unused ones filed or deleted. Animation is produced for scenes that are cut from episodes at various stages of completion. Music is composed and recorded for moments that do not make it to air. The scale of the potentially existing archive, if it were fully preserved, is enormous. The likelihood that all of it is preserved is essentially zero. Production companies make decisions about storage space and archival value in ways that are driven by practical considerations rather than by the interest of future historians or fans. Material that was not considered valuable at the time it was produced has frequently been discarded. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the formal archive of the show's production contains significantly more than what has been publicly released. DVD extras have given fans access to a certain amount of deleted content, mostly from seasons 4 onward. Commentary tracks have described scenes that were written and never produced or produced and cut. But these are the organized, curated pieces of production history that someone chose to make available. The informal archive, the raw recordings and early animation passes and discarded scripts that were not packaged for public consumption, is an unknown quantity. The recovery of the original 1,998 pitch pilot in March 2025 is a useful data point for thinking about this. The pilot existed on the personal portfolio website of an animator who worked on it. It had been there, accessible in principle to anyone who navigated to the right URL for whatever period of time it takes for someone to build a personal portfolio site and populate it with their work. It was found eventually, but only because the community of people who look for this kind of thing is both persistent and methodical. The question of what other material exists in similar states of informal availability, hosted on the personal sites or hard drives of people who worked on the show without any intention of releasing it publicly, is genuinely unanswerable. The Lost Media Wiki community has documented what is known. They track the status of specific pieces of content as confirmed existing, confirmed lost, or status unknown. The category of status unknown is the most interesting one, because it is the honest acknowledgement that the boundary between existence and non-existence cannot always be clearly drawn. Something might exist and simply not yet be found. The pilot existed for nearly 30 years without being found by the people looking for it. It was there the entire time. The category of what might be found in the future is where the conspiracy-adjacent thinking is most tempting and also most unreliable. The instinct to believe that something significant is out there, something that changes the story in a fundamental way, is a natural response to an incomplete archive. But the history of actually recovered lost media tends to suggest that what gets found is usually something that enriches the existing picture rather than upends it. The recovered pilot is a fascinating document of the show's origins, but it does not change what the show was. It adds context. It fills in a corner of the image that was previously blank. If there are pieces of Family Guy content currently sitting in archival storage somewhere that would, when they emerged, genuinely alter understanding of the show's history, they are almost certainly from the first 3 seasons. The creative peak. The era before the full archival infrastructure was in place. The period from which the least has been released and the most can be reasonably assumed to have been generated and then set aside. Whether any of it will surface is a matter of time, circumstance, and the decisions of the people and institutions that hold it. Part 15. The Voice in the Dark. There is one more theory worth sitting with before this exploration winds down. It is not the darkest theory, and it is not the most elaborate, but it is the one that seems to capture something true about what it feels like to engage with this show from a particular angle. The theory observes that Family Guy, from its very earliest seasons, has always been a show about a man who should not be happy but somehow is. Peter Griffin is working class. He is not educated. He is not gifted in any particularly practical way. He drinks too much. He makes terrible decisions. He accidentally harms the people around him with a frequency that would, in any realistic framework, have consequences that accumulated and ultimately destroyed the life he was living. And yet, at the end of every episode, the house is still there. The family is still there. The bar is still there. His friends are still there. The morning after whatever catastrophic thing happened last week looks exactly like every other morning. The theory reads this not as a structural convenience of animated comedy, but as the show's deepest emotional statement. That the reason nothing sticks, the reason consequences do not accumulate, the reason everything resets, is because the show is fundamentally about the fantasy of a world where you get to keep what you love even when you do not deserve to keep it, where the people who should have left a long time ago have not left, where the damage you do dissolves overnight and everyone is there at the breakfast table the next morning. This is a different reading from the dead family theory. It does not require anyone to be in a hospital or a coffin. It is simpler than that. It proposes that Family Guy's reset button is not a lazy writing convention and not a symptom of psychosis. It is the show's deepest wish fulfillment. The fantasy it is selling is not wealth or adventure or freedom. It is the fantasy of getting to stay, of still being there, of waking up in the same house with the same family on the same street no matter what you did the day before. That reading makes the show stranger and sadder and, in some ways, more affecting than it appears to be. It makes the reset button into something like a prayer. Keep them there. Let them still be there tomorrow. Let nothing that happens today be the thing that finally makes them leave. Whether McFarlane intended any of this is entirely beside the point. Creators do not always know what they are making. The material that rises from a show over 25 seasons accumulates, meaning that was not necessarily planted there. Patterns emerge that nobody designed. The chaos of collaborative storytelling sometimes produces, by accident or by the aggregate pressure of many minds working towards something they cannot fully articulate, something that resonates in ways that no individual decision can account for. The lost episodes, the deleted scenes, the banned content, the recovered pilot, the theories that fans have built in the spaces between what is known and what is unknown, all of it circles the same center. A show that has been going longer than some of its viewers have been alive, made by people trying to say something they could not always say directly, about a family that keeps surviving things families are not supposed to survive. The dark material is there because darkness is honest. The comedy is there because comedy is how some people approach the things they cannot bear to approach directly. What is lost is lost. What was never made exists as the outline of what might have been. And what remains is what it is. A strange, inconsistent, brilliant, often terrible, occasionally transcendent piece of American popular culture that has more going on beneath its surface than most of its viewers will ever bother to look for. Part 16. The documented errors and what fans found in the frames. There is a subset of Family Guy scholarship, if that word can be applied to something this informal, that concerns itself specifically with what appears in the backgrounds and margins of episodes. The gags hidden in newspaper headlines, the hidden text on signs and screens, the references buried in the background so small that you would only notice them by pausing on a specific frame. The show has a documented history of including content designed to be seen only by people paying extremely close attention. Headlines that read DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed. Signs in the background of crowd scenes that contain jokes unrelated to the main action. Visual gags running in the background while the foreground dialogue is happening about something else entirely. This is deliberate. It is a specific aspect of the show's relationship with its most dedicated viewers. The show knows people pause the content. It has acknowledged this in multiple ways, and it has created content that rewards that behavior. What this means for the lost content conversation is that some of what is technically present in the show has never been seen by most viewers and exists in a functional state of invisibility. Not every background text has been decoded. Not every visual gag in a crowd scene has been identified and cataloged. The completeness of what fans have documented is genuine but not total. There are things in the frames that nobody has looked at carefully enough yet to notice. This is a different kind of loss from a deleted scene or a banned episode, but it belongs in the same conversation. Content that exists in the broadcast record but has not been seen or processed by any human eye is not exactly lost, but it is not exactly present either. It occupies the liminal space between having been made and having been received. The production of the show involved artists and writers who put things into frames knowing that the majority of viewers would never see them. The choice to do that is interesting in itself. It is a form of communication directed not at the general audience, but at a specific subset of viewers who engage with the material in a particular way. It is the show speaking to a future investigator, leaving things for someone to find. The found content in this category, the headlines and signs and background details that fans have decoded and shared, forms a secondary text of the show, one that runs parallel to the broadcast narrative and sometimes comments on it. The things not yet found form the edge of that secondary text, the boundary beyond which the content fades into background noise that has not yet been resolved into meaning. Part 17. The 30 Years and What They Built. By the time Family Guy reaches its 30th anniversary, which under the deal announced in April 2025, it is intended to reach in the 2028 to 2029 television season, it will have been running for longer than most of its original audience has been watching television. The show that debuted in the post-Super Bowl slot in January 1999 and pulled in 22 million viewers on its first night will have been making new episodes for 3 decades. The lost content from those 30 years, taken as a whole, represents something worth naming directly. The banned episodes, the modified scenes, the retroactively suppressed material, the unarchived deleted scenes from the golden era, the pitch pilot that wandered in digital oblivion for almost 3 decades. These are not random or incidental losses. They form a shape. They document a show that has consistently been in conflict with the forces that would constrain it. A show whose most interesting and most honest moments have frequently been the ones that someone, somewhere, decided the audience should not see. The history of what was taken out is inseparable from the history of what was left in. Every banned episode illuminates the episodes that were allowed to air. Every deleted scene defines by its absence the boundary of what the production decided was acceptable. The shape of the archive, including its gaps, tells you something about what the show was trying to do, that the episodes themselves, taken individually, cannot fully communicate. McFarlane's near death on the 11th of September 2001 shaped a decade of the show's relationship with terrorism, history, and consequence in ways that the show itself could never quite articulate directly. The show made jokes about it. It wrote itself into it, with Brian the dog functioning as McFarlane's admitted authorial avatar, getting drunk at an airport bar, and missing a flight in a Season 2 episode that aired before the attacks, and then missing them for real in a Season 10 episode about whether preventing them would have made things better or worse. The whole arc is strange and personal and not fully explained. The fan theories built on the foundation of the show's genuine structural oddities, its reset button, its cruelty, its flashes of warmth in places where cruelty has become the dominant tone, describe in their distorted way something real about the experience of watching a show for long enough that you start to feel its contradictions as something that requires explanation. The Peter is in a mental institution theory is not a description of what the show is, but it is a description of how the show feels to someone who has watched enough of it to stop being able to ignore the gap between what it wants to be and what it sometimes is. The recovered pilot from 2025 is, in its own way, a gift. The chance to see the show at the moment before it became itself, when it was still a collection of possibilities rather than a defined thing, when the characters were still being discovered rather than established, when the reset button had not yet become a crutch because there was nothing yet to reset from. Everything that is missing from the official archive of the show, every scene that was cut and every episode that was shelved and every musical number that was recorded and never broadcast, is a piece of the show's real history, the history that did not make it to air. The night is quieter now than it was when we started. Whatever is happening outside your window has probably settled into its late-night patterns. The kind of quiet that comes when almost everyone has gone to sleep and the world is not quite asking anything of you for a little while. The story of what Family Guy lost or hid or never fully made is a story about the relationship between what gets said and what gets held back, between the thing you make and the thing you are allowed to show, between the version of yourself you put in front of an audience and the version that exists in the production archive, in the early drafts, in the recordings that were made and then never released. That gap is where the interesting stuff lives. It always is. Part 18. Specific scenes, specific absences. A closer look at what the archive tells us. There is value in being specific about what is actually documented as missing, rather than staying at the level of general discussion, because the specific cases are more strange and more interesting than the general account. The airport scene from Road to Rhode Island is documented in multiple sources as having existed in the original broadcast, been removed for syndication and initial DVD release, and then partially restored in certain later release formats. The exact configuration of availability across different platforms and release versions is something that continues to confuse people who try to track down the original version of the episode. The version on Hulu has apparently restored the scene. The version on some cable syndication packages has not. The region-specific DVD releases vary. If you encountered the episode for the first time through a version that lacked the scene, you would have no indication from the episode itself that something was absent. The version of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein that most streaming viewers will encounter today uses the modified lyric recorded for broadcast, the one that says, "I don't think they killed my lord," rather than the original, "Even though they killed my lord." The animation in that moment was never changed to match the new audio, which means Peter Griffin's lip movements in that scene do not correspond to what is being said. This is documented in trivia records and production notes. It is a permanent artifact of the compromise made between production intent and broadcast standards, visible to anyone who looks carefully enough. The partial terms of endearment situation, the episode that has never been broadcast in the United States and is absent from the Hulu library, creates what amounts to an invisible gap in the Season 8 run. Someone navigating the Family Guy catalog on Hulu would encounter Season 8 with no indication that an episode is absent. The platform does not flag the gap. The episode count for the season does not acknowledge what is missing. The gap exists in a state of designed invisibility, which is a different thing from the episode simply not existing. The Turban Cowboy situation documented an episode that was pulled from Hulu for approximately 9 years following the Boston Marathon bombing, and that has been partially restored to various platforms while remaining unavailable on Disney Plus in the United States. The episode's status across different distribution channels continues to be inconsistent, reflecting the ongoing institutional uncertainty about whether the risk associated with the content has sufficiently diminished. The deleted scenes from seasons 1 through 3 represent perhaps the most significant archival gap in the entire show, because they cover the period most central to the show's cultural legacy. No full-color deleted scenes from these seasons have ever been made publicly available in any official release format. The fact that deleted scenes exist from this period is confirmed by promotional material from 1999. The content of those scenes, beyond the 2 brief clips visible in that promotional material, is unknown. The pitch pilot, recovered in March 2025, filled in the most significant single gap in the show's public archive, providing a complete picture of what the show looked like before it became the show. The recovery is a reminder that archival completeness is a moving target, that things can remain hidden for extraordinary lengths of time and then surface through the most ordinary of mechanisms. A personal portfolio website, an animator keeping their old work online. The song The List from the Season 6 two-parter sits in a middle state. Its existence is documented in television databases. Its content is described in production notes, but no recording or animation has been publicly released. It is confirmed existing, at least in production archive form, but effectively inaccessible. This map of specific absences, drawn together, suggests something about what kind of show Family Guy has been, one that consistently generated more material than it broadcast, that consistently came into conflict with the forces that governed what could be shown, and that consistently left traces of what did not make it to air that are findable if you look for them. Part 19. The theories that the show generated about itself. The internet's engagement with Family Guy has produced something genuinely unusual, a body of theories so extensively developed and so widely circulated that they have become part of the show's cultural identity in a way that is almost independent of the show itself. The Peter and the mental institution theory is the most famous, but it is not the only framework that fans have built to explain the show's structural oddities. There is the theory that Stewie's de-aging throughout the show, remaining approximately 1 year old despite the Griffin children aging in various episodes, is a deliberate action Stewie himself takes. In this reading, Stewie uses his time machine and various technologies to periodically reset his own age because he values his adventures with Brian and wants to preserve them indefinitely. The normal aging of childhood would eventually separate them. Brian would age and die, Stewie would grow up. Stewie, unwilling to accept this, intervenes to keep the dynamic stable. This theory is interesting partly because it makes the continuity problems of the show into Stewie's doing, making the character responsible for the show's own narrative structure. It also makes Stewie's friendship with Brian something genuinely precious to him in a way that his outward persona might not always convey. There is the theory that Brian Griffin is not actually a dog in the traditional sense, but is instead a human consciousness transferred or projected into a dog's body, explaining his linguistic and intellectual capabilities in a way that goes beyond the simple magic realism of talking dog. In this version, Brian's alcoholism, his failed writing career, his complicated romantic history, and his recurring existential crisis all make more sense as the experiences of a human intelligence trapped in a form that the world does not fully recognize as capable of those experiences. There is the theory concerning Meg's true nature that builds on the mental institution framework, but extends it in a different direction, proposing that Meg's function in the show's internal logic is not simply as a victim, but as something like a pressure valve or an anchor point for the entire family's dysfunction. This theory finds its strongest textual support in the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, where Meg's willingness to return to being the family's target after her confrontation is presented as something she does for them, to hold them together. The theory reads this not as the show's most troubling moment, endorsing abuse as a social good, but as a genuine tragedy. A character who understands her own role with terrible clarity and chooses to continue playing it because the alternative is the family's dissolution. What all of these theories share is an engagement with the show as something that rewards careful reading, that contains more than it presents, that has a logic operating beneath its surface chaos. Whether or not that is the correct way to approach a show that has explicitly acknowledged its own laziness in multiple self-referential moments, the instinct is understandable. The show has been running long enough and has generated enough genuinely strange material that the impulse to find the pattern in the noise is nearly irresistible. Part 20. The Night, the Archive, and the Space Between. The reason this kind of content works as something you listen to in the dark, as something you let wash over you while you drift toward sleep, is precisely because of the quality of uncertainty that runs through all of it. There is something specific about not quite knowing. The deleted scene that might exist on a storage drive in a production company's archive, the episode that aired in one country and not another, the song that was recorded and never released, the pilot that existed on a personal website for years before anyone found it. The theory that cannot be confirmed or refuted because the show itself is too inconsistent to provide stable evidence for anything. This territory is different from a simple horror story or a ghost story. It does not traffic in the explicit. It deals in gaps. In the spaces where information stops and imagination is invited to continue, the things that are almost known are more unsettling than the things that are fully unknown, because they are close enough to real that you cannot dismiss them, and far enough from complete that you cannot resolve them. The Bin Laden airport scene in the episode made by a man who should have been on the first plane that hit the towers. The episode about abortion that aired everywhere in the world except where it was made. The episode that got pulled from streaming for 9 years because someone edited it in a dark room and put the lie online. The pitch pilot that nobody could find for 27 years because it was just sitting there. The deleted song from the last episode that took the character seriously before he was softened. Each of these is real, documented. The specifics are accurate, and together they describe a show that has spent 25 years generating material that someone, somewhere, decided should not be fully seen. The reasons are different in each case. Political sensitivity, legal risk, timing and tragedy, archival accident, business calculation. The decisions were made by different people with different concerns at different points in the show's long history. None of them are particularly mysterious when you understand the context. All of them are worth knowing. What sits beneath all of it, the thing the fan theories are reaching for, even when they reach in the wrong direction, is the awareness that a show that has been making content for this long has a relationship with the culture around it that is impossible to fully document. The show absorbed the September 11th attacks and produced a creator who kept finding ways to write about them without ever being able to fully address them directly. The show absorbed political shifts and social changes and its own internal disputes, and the departure of its creator's attention, and the pressure of commercial viability, and the changing standards of what could be said and shown. It absorbed all of this and kept going. The lost episodes are where some of that absorption showed most clearly. The places where the content pressed against the boundary of what was allowed, and the boundary pressed back. The places where the show said something it was not supposed to say, or tried to, and the record of that attempt was removed from the standard version of the archive. Those gaps are part of the show's history. They are not the most important part. The episodes that aired, the characters that endured, the comedy that connected with millions of people across a generation, those are the most important part. But the gaps are real, and they say something true. Part 21. Closing the archive. Opening the night. Every archive has edges. Every collection of material has things it contains and things it does not contain, and the things it does not contain say as much about what it is as the things it does. The gaps are structural, not accidental, even when the specific absences are the result of individual decisions made by individual people at particular moments in the show's history. The story of Family Guy's lost episodes and buried conspiracies is ultimately a story about the relationship between a show and the forces that shaped what it was allowed to be. The network that would not air an abortion episode. The historical event that made a throwaway joke impossible to leave in place. The fabricated video that sent an episode into nearly a decade of streaming limbo. The production culture that did not systematically archive the work of its creative peak. The creator who moved on while the show continued, leaving a version of the project without its original guiding intelligence. All of these things produced a show whose official archive is a partial record of what was actually made, and whose actual history is correspondingly more complicated than the catalog of available episodes suggests. The theories that fans have built around that incompleteness are exercises in imagination, attempts to make coherent sense of a large and inconsistent body of work. The best of them are genuinely clever. The most famous of them, the mental institution theory, captures something emotionally true about the show's relationship with consequence and loss, even though it is not a description of what the show literally is. These theories are part of the show's cultural life. They are how some of its most dedicated viewers make sense of it. What actually exists, what is documented and real, is strange enough to hold your attention through a long night. The pilot that was found on a personal website after 27 years. The episode that has never aired in the country where it was made. The scene that vanished from the standard version of the show's most acclaimed episode because its creator narrowly survived one of the worst days in American history. The song that was recorded for a character saying goodbye to the best version of himself and never released. These are the things that were made and then hidden, or lost, or set aside or held back. They are the edges of the show's archive, the places where the official record ends and the territory of the incomplete begins. The night is its own archive. It holds things the daylight does not. The quiet that makes it possible to think about this kind of content without distraction, to let the strangeness of it register, to sit with what is documented and what is theorized and what remains genuinely unknown. The show has been making episodes since 1999. By the time it reaches its 30th year, it will have been part of the cultural air for longer than most of the people watching it have been conscious. What it said, what it tried to say, what it was prevented from saying, what it said and then pretended it had not said all of it, is part of the record. The record is incomplete. Some of it always will be. That is where we leave it tonight. In the space between the documented and the possible, between what is confirmed and what is theorized, between the episodes that aired and the ones that did not. Between the pilot found on a personal website in March 2025 and whatever else is still out there, sitting in someone's archive or someone's hard drive or someone's memory, waiting for someone to look in the right place, sleep well. The archive will still be there in the morning. If you stayed with this the whole way through, that means something. This kind of content takes time to make, and it takes time to receive, and finding an audience for it is the only thing that makes more of it possible. If you want to see more explorations like this one, subscribing is the single most useful thing you can do. Leave a comment if there is a corner of this territory you want to explore more deeply. There is always more to say. Script composed for Uncle Guy Lore. All factual claims are based on documented sources including Lost Media Wiki, IMDb alternate versions records, TV tropes, trivia documentation, and contemporaneous reporting. Theories and fan interpretations are clearly identified as such throughout. Part 22. The Untold Story and What It Added, What It Lost. In 2005, a few months before Family Guy returned to air for its 4th season, something unusual happened in the show's publishing history. A direct-to-DVD film called Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, was released into the market on September 27th of that year. It was 88 minutes long. It was rated unrated, which meant it had bypassed the standard ratings board process, allowing it to contain material that the broadcast version of the show had to be more careful about. The film was eventually broken into 3 episodes and aired as the Season 4 finale in May 2006, but the version that aired on Fox was significantly shorter than the DVD version. Fox cut the film down from 88 minutes to 66 minutes. New scenes were added, existing scenes were altered. The version that broadcast audiences saw was not the same film that people who bought or rented the DVD had watched 8 months earlier. This matters because it created 2 distinct versions of an official piece of the show's canon. The DVD version of Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, contains material that was never broadcast, that was edited out specifically because Fox's broadcast standards required it to be. The scenes that were removed or altered in the transition from the DVD release to the television broadcast exist only in the DVD version and only for people who have access to that specific physical product or a digital version of it. The film's plot centers on Stewie having a near-death experience that temporarily softens his personality, followed by a journey to San Francisco where he and Brian discover what appears to be Stewie's biological father, who turns out to be a future version of Stewie himself. The story involves Stewie confronting questions about who he is going to become, and the film ends with the implication that the future version has become someone comfortable with his own identity in ways the present version is still working toward. This narrative arc has been interpreted by some fans as an early signal of the character transformation that would become more pronounced in later seasons. The film was produced during the transition period, when the show was finding its post-revival identity, and the Stewie it depicts is already partially different from the early season villain who wanted to murder his mother and achieve world domination. The near-death experience at the film's beginning functions structurally as a kind of reset of Stewie's motivations, an in-universe justification for the character becoming gentler and more internally focused. What the DVD-only content from this film represents in terms of the lost content conversation is a relatively unusual case, material that is not lost in the sense of being inaccessible, but that exists in a state of formal separation from the show's broadcast record. The episodes that aired on Fox are part of the show's official Season 4. The DVD film that preceded them by 8 months, containing additional scenes and uncut versions of moments that were trimmed for broadcast, is a parallel artifact that the average viewer who watched the show on television never encountered. The question of which version is the real film is formally interesting. The DVD version was the original release and represents the creative intent of the production team working outside the constraints of broadcast standards. The television version is the one that exists in the show's official episode sequence. Both are real in the sense of having been officially produced and released. But only one of them has ever been fully accessible to the majority of the show's audience. Part 23. The Writers' Strike, the Broken Rhythm, and What Those Gaps Produced. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike disrupted production of Family Guy at a specific and sensitive moment in the show's development. The strike began in November 2007 and lasted until the 12th of February 2008. For a show that depends on the continuous work of a large writing staff to maintain its production schedule, 3 months of complete shutdown had consequences that extended well beyond the immediate interruption. What gets less attention in discussions of the strike's impact on Family Guy is what happened to the episodes that were in various stages of development when the strike began. A certain number of scripts would have been in early drafts. Others would have been further along in the revision process. Some would have been in production, with voice recordings scheduled or already completed. The strike froze all of this in place. When production resumed in February 2008, the show did not simply pick up where it left off. The creative momentum that comes from a writing staff that has been continuously working together on the same project, developing shared understandings of where stories are going and what the show's current register is, had been interrupted. New approaches had to be found. The staff that reassembled in February was, in some cases, not identical to the one that had stopped working in November. People had taken other projects during the 3 months. Some of them did not come back. The show's creator, Seth MacFarlane, was publicly supportive of the strike and participated in the picketing. He made it clear that he stood with the writers. But he also acknowledged, both during and after this period, that the recurring pattern of the show being interrupted, whether by cancellations or by external events like the strike, consistently damaged the creative continuity that made the writing work best. The writers who were available to the show in any given period were not always the same writers who had been there before. The tone shifted with each new addition to and departure from the room. There is a specific piece of content that emerged from the period around the writer's strike that belongs in the lost content conversation. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 episodes of Family Guy that had already been completed before the strike began. MacFarlane objected to this. The episodes were broadcast over his explicit objection, on the grounds that Fox held the contractual right to air content that was technically finished and in their possession. The airing of those 3 episodes against the creator's wishes is documented but not extensively discussed in most accounts of the show's history. What it represented was a formal assertion of Fox's authority over material that MacFarlane had made but no longer fully controlled, and it happened at a moment when MacFarlane was already on the picket line, supporting writers against exactly the kind of corporate decision-making that prioritized network interests over creative workers' interests. The episodes themselves were not secret or suppressed. They aired normally, but the context in which they aired, against the creator's stated wishes during a labor action he was publicly supporting, created a kind of contamination in the show's relationship with its own broadcast record. Those 3 episodes exist with a shadow attached to them that their content alone does not explain. The broader question of what the strike disrupted in terms of planned story development is impossible to answer precisely from the outside. The writers who were in the room before the strike know what they were working on. Some of it presumably became episodes that aired in the show's subsequent seasons. Some of it was abandoned when the creative momentum that would have carried those stories forward was lost during the interruption. The show that emerged from the strike period was measurably different in certain ways from the show that entered it, but tracing specific losses of specific content back to the strike specifically, rather than to the general creative drift of the period, is not something the available documentation supports. Part 24. MacFarlane as Brian, the author avatar, and What That Tells Us. Seth MacFarlane has confirmed in various interviews over the years that Brian Griffin is, in some meaningful sense, an authorial self-portrait. Brian is the character who most directly reflects MacFarlane's own sensibility, who shares his political views, who voices his aesthetic preferences, who functions as the show's most direct conduit for what the show's creator actually thinks about the world. This biographical reading of Brian is interesting in the context of the lost and altered content discussion, because it suggests that content involving Brian carries an additional layer of significance beyond what the surface material contains. When Brian is shown to be struggling, when his character is constructed in ways that make him unsympathetic, when his failures are depicted with unusual persistence, these choices are not just about a fictional talking dog. They are about a creator's relationship with his own self-image, mediated through the character he built as a proxy. The decline of Brian as a sympathetic character across the show's run has been discussed extensively in terms of what it did to the show's internal dynamics. But in the context of this biographical connection, the question becomes more personal. What does it mean that the character MacFarlane built as his own representative in the show became, according to a broad consensus of fans and critics, the most insufferable character in it? What does it mean that the character who was supposed to be the voice of reason became the character whose self-delusion and hypocrisy were most consistently foregrounded? The most charitable reading is that this represents a kind of honest self-criticism. MacFarlane, using the distance of fiction, was able to depict in Brian the ways in which the pretensions of a certain kind of liberal intellectual can curdle into exactly the self-congratulatory fraudulence that those pretensions are supposed to oppose. The Brian of the later seasons, who talks about great literature and moral responsibility while behaving with consistent cruelty and selfishness, is a portrait of a failure mode that MacFarlane, as someone who occupies a similar cultural position, presumably knew from close observation. The less charitable reading is that the writer's room, as MacFarlane's direct involvement diminished, simply stopped being careful enough with the character to maintain his dignity. Without the creator actively protecting the character's core decency, Brian drifted in the direction that the show's broader tendency toward cruelty and shock value would naturally take him. Both readings are probably partially true, but the biographical dimension adds something to the account of what was lost as Brian changed. What was lost was not just a likable character. What was lost was a certain kind of self-recognition that the show offered its audience. The possibility of a character who was flawed but fundamentally decent, who wanted good things and mostly tried to do them, who failed in recognizable and human ways. The Brian who emerged in the later seasons was a different kind of self-portrait, if the biographical connection held. A portrait of what happens when the failure mode fully takes over, when the pretensions stop being supported by genuine substance, when the reaching for something better becomes indistinguishable from mere posturing. The Road to Rhode Island episode, considered by most people with strong opinions about the show to be its single greatest achievement, is a Brian episode. It is the episode in which Brian's backstory is first substantively explored, in which his complicated relationship with his own origins is revealed, in which the emotional texture of the character is given the most direct treatment the show ever managed. MacFarlane has called it his favorite episode. It is also notably the episode that contains the deleted scene that became impossible to include after September 11th, the scene where Brian is drunk in an airport bar, missing a flight, while Osama bin Laden sings show tunes in the security line. The layers of that episode, the personal best, the autobiographical shadow, the deleted scene that carries the weight of what did not happen on September 11th, are not separable from each other. They form a single thing that is more significant than any of its parts taken individually. Part 25. The Conspiracy Industry Around the Show. It is worth being honest about the ecosystem of theories and conspiracies that surrounds Family Guy specifically because it is larger and more varied than most people realize, and because part of understanding what is real requires understanding what is not real. There is an entire genre of content, particularly on video platforms, that presents fabricated or heavily embellished stories about Family Guy as though they were documented facts. These videos follow a consistent template. A narrator describes watching an episode that seemed normal at first, then progressively more disturbing, featuring content that the show never actually contained, often involving characters behaving in ways that are entirely out of character, sometimes claiming that the narrator acquired the episode through some unusual channel, a screener copy, a leaked internal print, a DVD found at a garage sale. These are creepypastas. They are short horror fiction dressed up as authentic documentation. Some of them are well-written and atmospheric, some of them are crude and obvious. None of them describe episodes that actually exist. The genre has been active around Family Guy for roughly as long as creepypasta as a form has existed as a recognized category. This is partly a function of the show's enormous cultural footprint. Any long-running piece of popular media generates a corresponding body of fan fiction, and dark fan fiction about familiar properties has been a recognizable category since well before the internet gave it the name creepypasta. The shows that attract the most of this kind of content tend to be ones that already engage with darkness in their official material, because the distance between the real show and the imagined horror version is shorter, and the blending is more convincing. Family Guy attracts more of this than most shows for a specific reason. The show has already done things that, in other contexts, would read as horror content. Stewie genuinely tried to kill his mother for 3 seasons. The graphic violence of the later seasons went places that standard animation does not go. The show has dealt with death, abuse, and trauma in ways that sometimes treated those subjects with less care than they required. The gap between the official show and the invented dark version of the official show is, in Family Guy's case, narrower than it is for a show like, say, a children's cartoon property. This narrowness creates the conditions for convincing blending. A well-written creepypasta about Family Guy can feel almost plausible because the show has already established that it is capable of going dark. The fiction does not have to ask the audience to accept a complete departure from the property's established character. It just has to ask them to accept that the darkness went a little further than they knew. The practical consequence of this for anyone trying to research the actual history of lost and banned Family Guy content is that the search results and the conversation around the subject are heavily contaminated with fiction presented as fact. Genuinely documented cases like the partial terms of endearment ban, or the Road to Rhode Island deletion, or the turban cowboy pulling, are mixed in the conversation with completely invented stories about episodes that never existed, and distinguishing between them requires the kind of careful sourcing that most casual researchers do not have the time or inclination to do. The Lost Media Wiki and TV Tropes documentation sections are the most reliable resources for this because they apply consistent sourcing standards and explicitly categorize content as confirmed, partially found, unconfirmed, or known fiction. The community around lost media research has developed methodologies for exactly this kind of verification, and they are worth consulting when a specific claim seems either too strange to be true or just plausible enough that you cannot be sure. What the creepypasta ecosystem reveals, despite not being literally true in its claims, is something genuine about how the show is received. People find Family Guy unsettling in ways that the show itself does not always fully account for. The cruelty toward Meg, the later season's graphic violence, the character deteriorations that nobody within the show's world acknowledges, the inexplicable persistence of a family dynamic that should have collapsed under its own toxicity long ago, these things create an ambient unease that the creepypasta genre is, in its own way, trying to articulate. The invented dark episodes are attempts to give form to something that viewers sense in the official show, but cannot quite name. Part 26. The geography of the show and what was hidden in it. The fictional Rhode Island town where Family Guy is set has its own internal geography, a physical space that has been depicted and described over more than 400 episodes, with enough consistency to map and enough inconsistency to generate numerous fan discussions about what the place actually looks like. The town's geography is not the kind of thing that most discussions of lost content address, but it is relevant here because some of the show's most interesting hidden material exists in the details of that space. Background artists and production designers inserted details into the town's physical environment that function as running gags, Easter eggs, or commentaries on the show's own content that never appear in the foreground of any episode. The show's engagement with its own geography has produced some specific documented content that occupies the lost or near-lost territory. In the earlier seasons, when the production design was being established and the physical world of the show was being built out, the background artists developed materials that were more elaborate than what the broadcast episodes required. Reference sheets, character sheets, location guides, and background materials were produced in quantities that far exceeded what was ever fully visible to viewers. Some of this design documentation has surfaced through production art sales and the publications of people who worked on the show. Most of it has not. There is a specific category of this material that relates to the show's ongoing self-commentary. Family Guy has always been conscious of its own medium, aware that it is an animated television show and willing to make jokes about that awareness. The backgrounds and physical spaces of the show sometimes contain references to its own production history, to the relationship between the show and its network, or to events in the show's behind-the-scenes life that the dialogue never directly addresses. Tracking these visual references is part of the work that the most dedicated segment of the fan community does, and it has produced a secondary document of the show that exists in parallel to the episode narratives. The show's full visual record, including all the details that were placed in frames without any expectation that viewers would notice them, is itself a kind of hidden text that has been only partially decoded. Part 27, The International Archive: What Other Countries Kept. The global distribution of Family Guy created a situation where different countries ended up with different versions of the show's history. The complex of decisions that determined what aired where and when produced, over the course of the show's run, a set of national archives that are not identical to each other. In the United Kingdom, for example, Partial Terms of Endearment aired on BBC Three in June 2010 at 10:30 inches the evening, in primetime, to approximately 1 million viewers. It received positive reviews. The episode that Americans have never seen on television was, to British audiences, just another Family Guy episode. The absence of controversy in the UK airing is itself informative about how much of the risk calculus that led to the American ban was specific to the American political context around abortion at that particular moment rather than to anything inherent in the episode's content. The Bin Laden airport scene from Road to Rhode Island was handled differently across international markets. The UK DVD release of the relevant season preserved the original scene. The US DVD release initially did not. The German DVD release also preserved it. So, viewers who purchased the DVD in Germany or the UK had access to the complete original version of the episode, while American viewers who purchased the same product in the US received a version with a scene removed. The question of which version is the episode is genuinely complicated by this distribution history. If you are trying to understand what the show actually said, as opposed to what was made available in any particular market, you have to navigate a matrix of regional variations that was not designed for the convenience of future researchers. The International Archive is also significant for what it preserved of early content that was modified for the domestic market. In some cases, original dialogue, original scenes, and original sequences that were changed for US broadcast are preserved in their original form in specific international releases. These versions are sometimes the only widely available documentation that the original version existed. This creates a situation where the most complete archive of certain Family Guy content is not in the country where the show was made, but in the countries where it was distributed without the modifications that the producing country required. It is a strange inversion of the usual assumption that the original source is the most authoritative version. Part 28. The Death Has a Shadow pilot. The show before it was the show. The original broadcast premiere of Family Guy, Death Has a Shadow, aired on the 31st of January 1999. It was not the pitch pilot. It was the first episode produced for broadcast, a different and more polished piece of work that translated the concept McFarlane had pitched to Fox into the form it would take as a weekly television series. But the relationship between Death Has a Shadow and the pitch pilot it was based on is not straightforward. The pitch pilot, recovered in March 2025, shows that the transition from the rough 1998 film to the broadcast episode involved significant creative choices. Scenes were reconceived. The animation was formalized. The characters' designs were refined into the versions that became canonical. The differences between the pitch pilot and the broadcast premiere are themselves a kind of documentation of what the show could have been versus what it became. In the pitch pilot, the characters move differently. The comedy has a slightly different rhythm. The sense of what the show's register was going to be is present but not fully resolved. It is a creator in process, not yet certain of all the decisions. What the broadcast episode represents is the creative work of translating a personal vision into a marketable product. That translation required compromises, adjustments to what was most idiosyncratic about the pitch version in order to make the show legible and accessible to the broadest possible audience. Some of what was most distinctive about the 1998 film was probably lost in that translation, replaced by something more ready for television. This is not a criticism of the broadcast episode, which is genuinely good and which established the show's identity successfully. It is an observation about what the production process requires and what it inevitably costs. The version of the show that existed only in Seth MacFarlane's head in 1998, before it had been pitched to a network or committed to production, is the most completely lost version of all. The pitch pilot is the closest available approximation of that version, and even it is already a translation, already a presentation designed to convince people rather than purely to express. What the show might have been if it had never needed to convince anyone of anything is, in a meaningful sense, the most interesting and the most unknowable piece of the show's history. Part 29. The Weight of What Runs. By the time Family Guy completes the renewal cycle announced in April 2025 and reaches its 30th anniversary in the 2028 to 2029 television season, it will have produced more than 450 episodes across more than 25 seasons. The sheer volume of material generates its own set of questions about what the complete archive of the show's production life contains. Consider the arithmetic of production. Each episode goes through multiple draft stages. Writers' room discussions that precede scripts, table reads that revise what was written, production drafts that are worked on during voice recording, post-production changes that happen in the editing room. The conservative estimate is that each broadcast episode is preceded by roughly 3 to 5 times as much material that was made in the process of making it. Alternative drafts, discarded scenes, unused takes, rewritten sequences. Across 450-plus episodes, even at the low end of that estimate, the complete production archive of Family Guy represents something on the order of the equivalent of 1,500 to 2,250 additional episodes of content. Most of that material is not episodes in any meaningful sense. It is fragments, rough drafts, discarded attempts. But it is material that was made in the process of making the show, and some fraction of it is genuinely interesting. The portions of this archive that have surfaced publicly through DVD extras and commentary tracks, and the occasional emergence of materials from production staff, represent a small fraction of what must theoretically exist. The DVD extras have given fans access to full-color deleted scenes from Season 4 onward. Commentary tracks have described scenes that never made it to full animation. Individual production staff members have shared materials at various points, sometimes deliberately and sometimes as part of their personal portfolios. What the full archive would contain, if it were somehow made public and accessible, is impossible to know in advance. It might contain material that significantly complicates the received narrative about the show's creative intentions. It might contain early versions of episodes that took the characters in directions that the final versions did not. It might contain scenes of the characters behaving in ways that the broadcast versions do not support, or of stories going places that the broadcast versions did not go. Or it might contain mostly mundane variations. Earlier drafts of jokes that were refined into the versions that aired, deleted scenes that were cut for time rather than for content, animation tests that show the technical process rather than creative alternatives. The production archives of most long-running shows, when they become accessible to researchers, turn out to contain more of the mundane than the significant. The process of making television, week after week, for 25 years, is mostly craft rather than revelation. But mostly mundane is not the same as containing nothing interesting, And the specific nature of Family Guy's history, the documented suppression, the modification, the lost pilot, the gap in the early season's archival record, suggests that the show's production history has at least some corners that would be genuinely worth examining by anyone interested in understanding the show's full relationship with itself. Part 30. The ongoing life of an incomplete archive. There is something worth saying about what it means to engage with a piece of popular culture whose archive is incomplete by design. Most of the missing Family Guy content is missing not because anyone failed to preserve it, but because someone actively decided it should not be available. The partial terms of endearment decision was not an archival failure. It was a choice. The Road to Rhode Island modification was not an accident. It was a response to specific circumstances that the people making the decision considered decisive. The turban cowboy removal was a reaction to a specific set of events. The gap in the early season's deleted scene record was a production practice of that era, one that subsequent eras moved away from. Each of these decisions made sense, or seemed to make sense, at the moment it was made. Some of them still seem to make sense. Others look different in retrospect. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein suppression, which kept an episode off American airwaves for 3 years, now looks more cautious than necessary, given how the episode was ultimately received when it finally did air, and how the satirical intent was understood by audiences who saw it without the framing of preemptive controversy. The question of whether the partial terms of endearment situation will eventually resolve, whether the episode will find its way onto American streaming platforms with the same completeness that other Family Guy episodes have, is genuinely open. The institutional preferences that kept it off American television for 15 years have not obviously changed. But the landscape of media distribution has changed enormously since 2010, and the mechanisms by which content is withheld from specific markets are considerably harder to maintain in an environment where physical media is declining and digital access is global. There are people who have seen partial terms of endearment in the United States. They bought the DVD. They watched it on BBC Three via streaming services that did not geofence the broadcast. They found other means that the internet makes possible. The episode is not truly inaccessible. It is formally inaccessible, which is a different thing. The line between those two states is one that technology continues to erode. But the formal inaccessibility is itself meaningful. A piece of content that is not available through the standard channels, that cannot be found through a simple search of the platforms where you normally watch the show, that requires specific knowledge and deliberate effort to locate. That content occupies a different position in the cultural life of the work than content that is simply present and findable. The effort required to access it changes who accesses it and how, and it preserves something of the scarcity and significance that surrounded the content when it was first suppressed. Part 31. Closing thoughts on the long watch. The night has a quality that hours of the day do not, which is that it makes certain kinds of attention possible that are harder to access when the demands of ordinary life are present. The quiet that makes it possible to sit with incomplete information, to stay in the territory of the not quite known, to let questions stay open rather than pushing for resolution. The lost and suppressed content of Family Guy is a map of a show's relationship with the limits placed on it. Every gap in the archive is a point where something that was made, or something that was attempted, came up against a boundary, a network that would not air it, an event that made it impossible to leave in place, a decision that something was better not preserved, a production practice that did not value what would later seem valuable. The gaps are real. Some of them are documented with specificity. Some of them are inferred from the evidence of their effects. Some of them are genuinely unknown. All of them are part of the show's complete history, even the ones that cannot be filled in because the material they represent is not accessible or may no longer exist. What we know is this: a pitch pilot made by one person in his home for $50,000 convinced a network to fund one of the longest-running animated shows in American television history. That pilot was considered lost media for nearly 30 years and was recovered when an animator's personal website was found to be hosting it. In the show's second season, a scene was made that depicted a known terrorist evading airport security at the same time that the show's creator was booked on a flight that would be used in a terrorist attack a year later. That scene was removed from the standard version of the episode but survives in certain release formats. The show made 2 episodes that have never aired on American broadcast television. It made 1 episode that was pulled from streaming for nearly a decade. It made no publicly available archive of deleted scenes from its first 3 seasons. It killed and resurrected a main character over 3 broadcast weeks in what was widely understood as a ratings strategy. Its creator developed a public hatred of the network, airing it while continuing to voice its main characters. All of that is the documented record. The space beyond the documented record is where the theories live, some of them clever and some of them invented, and some of them pointing at something real in a language that is not quite accurate. The theories are the audience's attempt to make sense of something large and inconsistent and ongoing. They are the show's viewers trying to understand the show's relationship with itself. The show keeps going. The archive keeps accumulating. Every season adds to the massive material that constitutes the show's complete history, and with it adds to the massive material that will be cut, modified, or set aside before the final episodes reach their audiences. The pattern that has characterized the show's production history from its first days continues. More is made than is shown. What is shown is not always exactly what was made. The gap between the two is where this conversation lives. The night is its own kind of archive. Hold what you know lightly. Let the rest stay open. If you spent this whole night here, that means something. Making this kind of content takes time and care, and finding the audience for it is what makes continuing it possible. If these are the kinds of questions that interest you, subscribe and you will find more of them waiting. Leave a comment if you are still awake, and if there is a corner of this history you want to go further into, say so. There is always more to explore. Sleep well. Part 32. The Animators Who Left Traces. There is a quiet category of lost and hidden Family Guy content that almost nobody discusses in the mainstream conversations about the show's history. The traces left by the people who animated it. Family Guy, like all American animated series produced for broadcast, has been animated in large part by studios operating in Asia. The show's animation has cycled through multiple studios across its history, and the particular studio working on any given block of episodes has a measurable effect on the visual character of those episodes. Fans who watch the show closely enough can identify which studio handled which episodes based on subtle differences in how the characters move, how expressions are rendered, how backgrounds are detailed. But below the level of which studio did which season, there are individual animators whose particular sensibilities can be identified in specific frames and sequences. Animation is a craft that, when practiced by an individual of distinctive skill or unusual perspective, leaves fingerprints that are readable to a sufficiently trained eye. Some of the animators who worked on Family Guy's early seasons were people with significant technical ability and personal artistic tendencies that sometimes express themselves in the work. A specific documented example, the TV Tropes trivia entry for Road to Rhode Island, notes the existence of an extremely obscure piece of content associated with that episode. One of the show's animators, apparently working with a degree of autonomy that was unusual for the production context, produced an extension of a scene from the episode that was, to use the trivia entry's careful phrasing, essentially animated adult content. The animator did this as what was described as an in-studio joke, something not remotely intended for broadcast and not included in any official release. The piece reportedly circulates in extremely limited form and is described as nearly impossible to find. This is worth discussing not because of what the content reportedly contains, but because of what it represents as a category of material. The animators working on a production that runs for this many years, producing this many frames of content, under the direction of a writer's room that they have some connection to but do not fully occupy, occasionally produce material that is entirely their own. Sometimes this material is the kind of benign workplace humor that exists in any long-running production. Sometimes it is something more unusual. The fact that an animator's personal joke can become one of the most difficult to locate pieces of material associated with a multi-billion-dollar entertainment franchise is a small illustration of how media archiving works in practice. The major archive, the broadcast record and the DVD extras, and the official production materials, is organized and maintained and generally findable. The informal archive, the personal laptops and hard drives of the hundreds of people who worked on the show over 25 years, is radically distributed and largely inaccessible. What gets preserved in those informal archives is entirely a function of individual choices that nobody coordinated or planned. The pitch pilot that was recovered in 2025, was in an informal archive. It survived because Robert Paulson, one of the animators who worked on it, kept it on his personal portfolio website. The recovery happened because someone in the lost media research community happened to look there. There is no reason to believe that Paulson's personal archive is the only informal archive containing materials from Family Guy's production history. There are almost certainly others, held by other people who worked on the show at various points, that have not yet been found or have been found privately without being made public. The universe of Family Guy content that exists somewhere, in some form, in some archive, formal or informal, is certainly larger than what has been publicly released. The question of what that additional material contains is, genuinely and probably permanently, unanswerable in its full specifics. Part 33. The audio record what the voice booth produced. Every episode of Family Guy begins in a recording booth, with the voice cast producing the performances that will ultimately be matched to the animated characters. The recording sessions for an episode typically happen before the animation is complete, because the voice performances are used by the animators to time and pace their work. A voice actor's reading of a line, the rhythm of the delivery, the specific emotional quality of a particular moment shapes how the animation will be constructed around it. Recording sessions produce raw recordings from which the final versions are drawn. Actors perform lines multiple times. They try variations. They sometimes improvise things that the writers did not put in the script. The director of the session, working from the script but aware that something unexpected sometimes works better than what was written, may encourage certain variations and note certain moments. Some of what gets recorded in these sessions makes it to the final episode. Most of it does not. The audio archive of a show like Family Guy is potentially enormous and potentially fascinating. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, 4 of the most significant characters. MacFarlane is also known as someone who improvises, who plays with material, who will explore a character's response to a situation beyond the written script when the session allows it. The hours of recorded material from MacFarlane in the voice booth across the show's 5-year production history represent a specific kind of archive that exists nowhere else. What is in those recordings beyond what ended up in the episodes? Likely a great deal of the mundane. Rejected takes, alternative readings that were tried and discarded because the original version worked better, technical errors that needed to be redone, but also, occasionally, something more unusual. A moment of genuine spontaneity that the directors of the session noted but ultimately chose not to use. A direction a character's voice took that the writers had not anticipated. A reading of a controversial line that pushed harder than the final broadcast version pushed. Some of this material has surfaced in DVD commentaries, where cast members and writers sometimes describe sessions and moments that were captured but did not make it to air. The commentary track for Road to Rhode Island is reportedly one of the richer examples of this, with participants describing moments from the production that the episode itself does not contain. The comprehensive audio archive of the show's recording sessions, if it exists and is organized in any retrievable form, would be one of the more interesting available documents of a major animated production's working life. Whether it exists in that form is unknown. Production sound archives are among the more inconsistently preserved categories of media production material because they are large in volume, and because their value as archive material was not always recognized at the time they were created. Part 34. The show's most successful self-criticism and what it implied. There is a specific episode from Season 8 that is worth examining in detail in the context of lost content and the show's relationship with its own nature. The episode is Brian and Stewie, and it aired on the 9th of May 2010. It is unique in the show's run. The premise is simple. Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked in a bank vault on a Saturday, with no other characters present and no way out until the bank opens on Monday. The episode consists entirely of the two of them talking to each other while locked in this space. There are no cutaway gags, there are no other characters, there are no references to events in the outside world. The episode exists in a kind of hermetically sealed space that is unlike anything else in the show's production history. What the two characters discuss in the course of this enforced proximity involves things that the show had never directly addressed before. Brian reveals that he keeps a loaded gun in a safety deposit box at this bank, and when Stewie presses him to explain why, Brian acknowledges that the gun exists because he thinks about ending his own life. The conversation that follows is genuinely serious. Stewie, reacting to this disclosure with something more than his usual performative brittleness, tells Brian that he would be devastated if Brian were gone. The episode ends with the two of them having arrived at something real, something that exists underneath the usual register of the show's comedy. The episode was praised extensively, both at the time and in subsequent assessments of the show's body of work. It demonstrated, in a way that was impossible to dismiss, that the show was capable of producing genuinely emotionally honest material when the writers chose to create a structure that forced it. No cutaways meant no escape routes from the conversation. No other characters meant no distribution of emotional weight across a larger cast. Just two characters in a room, required by the episode's premise to actually deal with each other. The obvious question that the episode raises is why the show could not do this more often. The episode itself serves as an implicit critique of the show's standard operating procedure: the cutaways, the episodic reset, the avoidance of genuine consequence. By producing an episode that deliberately stripped all of those mechanisms away and demonstrating that the result was better than almost anything the show normally produced, the writers were making an argument about their own show that they then largely declined to act on. The Brian and Stewie episode is not lost content in any formal sense. It aired, it is available, it is on Hulu, but it exists in the show's archive as a document of a path not taken, a demonstration of what was possible that was not followed by production choices that reflected that possibility. In that sense, it is adjacent to the lost content discussion. It is evidence of a version of the show that could have existed and did not, preserved in the body of a single episode that stands apart from the surrounding material in ways that everyone who watches it notices. Part 35. The long history of Family Guy and The Simpsons relationship. The relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons is one of the stranger dynamics in the history of American animated television, and it has its own body of semi-lost and strange content that is worth examining. Family Guy was accused almost from its first episodes of being too similar to The Simpsons. The set-up suburban American family, well-meaning but inadequate father, competent wife, children of varying levels of functionality was familiar enough that the comparison was inevitable. MacFarlane consistently denied that The Simpsons was a direct influence on the show's conception, pointing to the earlier Larry and Steve shorts as the more direct precursors. The two shows eventually produced an official crossover episode in 2014, The Simpsons Guy, which ran as the season 13 premiere of Family Guy. The episode is significant for several reasons in the context of this discussion. It is one of the longest episodes in Family Guy's history. It addressed the relationship between the two shows directly, with the characters of both properties meeting and the episode making explicit the competitive and comparative relationship that had existed between their respective fan bases for 15 years. The crossover episode also produced a significant amount of content that did not make it to air. The development of a crossover at this scale, involving two production companies with different creative teams and different institutional cultures, required an extensive negotiation process over both content and tone. The Simpsons writers' room and the Family Guy writers' room had to find common ground on what each show's characters were like and how they would interact, while navigating the long-standing tension between the shows. The material that was developed and discarded during this negotiation process is not publicly documented in any comprehensive way. But the existence of an elaborate development process is well established, and the principle that such processes generate significant unused material applies here as it does everywhere in the show's production history. The Simpsons Guy crossover also contains in its final broadcast form a subplot involving Meg and Lisa Simpson that is among the more sympathetic treatments Meg received in any episode from the show's middle and later seasons. Lisa's affirmation of Meg as someone who matters, who has something to offer, who deserves better than she has been given, stands as a piece of character rehabilitation that the show's own internal logic rarely allowed. It came through an encounter with a character from another show, one with a track record of treating its female characters with more consistent dignity. The fact that Meg's most compassionate treatment in the later seasons came partly through the involvement of The Simpsons' writing sensibility is itself a piece of information about the difference between the two shows. Approaches to their characters. Part 36. Specific continuity anomalies and what they suggest. One of the things that the fan theory community has spent the most time on, and that connects directly to the production history conversation, is the show's relationship with its own continuity. Family Guy has an inconsistent relationship with continuity. In some seasons and some episodes, it seems to operate as though previous episodes happened and their events matter. In other seasons and episodes, it operates as though each episode is essentially a fresh start, with no reference to what preceded it. This inconsistency is not evenly distributed across the show's run. It tends to cluster in ways that reflect changes in the writing staff and in the show's overall approach during particular creative periods. Some of the most discussed continuity anomalies involve the show's treatment of Stewie's abilities. In the early seasons, Stewie's time machine and ray guns were explained as products of his genius, material objects that he had constructed in his bedroom laboratory. The show treated these as real objects with physical presence in the show's world. Other characters occasionally encountered evidence of Stewie's technology, and there were moments when the show appeared to be building toward a confrontation between the evil baby's capabilities and the world's indifference to them. In the later seasons, Stewie's technology became more casually deployed. The time machine appeared when the plot required it and was absent when it did not. The internal logic of what the technology could do expanded and contracted as the story required, without any effort to maintain consistency. The show's relationship with Stewie's reality became more overtly comedic and less interested in the internal logic that the early seasons had established. This shift is documented in the episodes themselves. But the question of what changed in the production process to produce it, whether it was a deliberate decision, a gradual drift, or a consequence of the changing writing staff's different relationship with the character, is not fully answerable from the outside. Commentary tracks and interviews from the relevant period suggest that the shift was at least partially conscious, reflecting the writer's decision to prioritize comedy over internal consistency, but the full account of how and when specific decisions were made is not part of the public record. What the continuity anomalies leave behind is something that fans interpret as evidence of something else, whether that something else is a meta-narrative about the show's production history, a hidden thematic intention, or simply the accumulated weight of 25 years of inconsistent storytelling. The interpretation depends on what the interpreter brings to the viewing, but the anomalies themselves are real, and they are part of the complete document that the show constitutes. Part 37. The show's relationship with its own cancellations. One of the stranger aspects of Family Guy's history is that it was canceled twice and continued anyway. The first cancellation, in 2002, seemed definitive. Shows that are canceled do not typically come back. The combination of Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales that drove the show's revival was unprecedented in the history of American television, and the people who made it happen at the network level were responding to commercial signals that they had not seen before. The second cancellation, which actually came before the first, Fox had canceled Family Guy during its original run after poor ratings, and that decision was part of what created the circumstances that led to the Adult Swim deal and the DVD sales. Both cancellations form part of the show's origin mythology in ways that shape the show's later relationship with its own survival. What this history produced in the show's content is a specific quality of self-consciousness about its own existence. Family Guy, more than almost any other long-running animated show, has been aware of the contingency of its own continuation. The show knows it should not still be here. It was canceled. It came back because enough people wanted it back badly enough, and then it ran for 20 more years on the momentum of that improbable return. This awareness surfaces in various ways in the show's content. The fourth wall-breaking jokes about Fox's treatment of the show, the self-referential comments about the show's own declining quality, the occasional moments where characters seem aware that they are characters in a show that has been on for too long and are commenting on that awareness directly. The lost content from the first cancellation period is worth thinking about. In the 3 years between the show's original cancellation in 2002 and its revival in 2005, MacFarlane and other members of the original creative team presumably had ideas about what they would do if the show came back. Some of these ideas presumably made it into the revival seasons. Others presumably did not, either because they were abandoned during the development process or because the show's direction when it returned was different from what had been imagined during the hiatus. The show that came back in 2005 was different from the show that left in 2002. The changes are documented across multiple accounts from people involved in the production. Some of those changes represented intentional evolutions. Others represented losses, things that the original team had built that did not survive the hiatus. The specific content of both categories is not fully documented, but the 3-year gap is a real gap in the show's creative continuity, and what fell into that gap has never been fully recovered or accounted for. Part 38. What the Fox relationship produced and prevented. The relationship between Seth MacFarlane and Fox over the course of Family Guy's run produced, on one reading, one of the most commercially successful animated shows in the history of American television. On another reading, it produced a situation in which one of the most creatively gifted comedy writers of his generation spent 25 years making content for a network he publicly compared to a failing marriage. The documented moments of tension in this relationship have specific content implications. The 3 episodes aired during the 2007 to 2008 writers' strike against MacFarlane's wishes represent the clearest single instance of the network asserting its authority over content that the creator did not want. Broadcast. But the relationship produced many less dramatic versions of the same dynamic. Instances where network notes shaped what ended up in episodes, where content was modified to satisfy broadcast standards that MacFarlane would have preferred not to satisfy, where the commercial imperatives of the network and the creative intentions of the production were in conflict. The detailed record of these conflicts is not public, but MacFarlane's own statements about the relationship, his description of it as a failing marriage, his public expression of discomfort with Fox News' connection to the same parent company that aired his show, his signing of a major deal with NBC Universal in 2020 that represented a clear movement of his primary creative home away from the Fox ecosystem. All of these are data points that indicate a relationship characterized by ongoing friction. The content implications of that friction are impossible to fully document from the outside. We know about the episodes that were suppressed because their suppression was public. We know about the scenes that were modified because those modifications left detectable traces. What we do not know is what was never made because the anticipation of network resistance made it not worth attempting. The self-censorship that comes from a long experience of network notes, the creative decisions that are never made because the creator has learned from experience what the network will not accept, is the most invisible category of missing content. It does not leave a trace. It simply never enters the production pipeline. MacFarlane's creation of American Dad, which operated with different showrunners and a different creative culture, and which has by most assessments maintained a more consistent quality over its run, suggests that the Family Guy-specific dynamic with Fox had specific creative consequences. American Dad had the same network, the same parent company, but a different showrunner relationship, and the results differed in ways that are worth noting. Part 39. What the most devoted fans preserved. The community of Family Guy fans who engage with the show at the deepest level of archival interest has produced over the years a body of documentation that, taken together, constitutes a secondary record of the show's history that sometimes captures things the official record does not. This community includes people who record and archive broadcast airings of episodes, comparing them against DVD releases and streaming versions to document differences. It includes people who have assembled the most complete available documentation of which scenes exist in which versions, which dialogue changes were made between initial broadcast and subsequent release, and what the discrepancies between international and domestic releases consist of. The Lost Media Wiki is the most organized hub for this community's work. Its Family Guy entries document the current status of various pieces of content with a degree of specificity and accuracy that goes well beyond what any official source provides. The Pitch Pilot's recovery in 2025 was documented through this community before it was reported anywhere in mainstream media. The status of the When You Wish Upon a Weinstein early draft is tracked there with ongoing updates as new information surfaces. This community's work represents a form of historical preservation that operates independently of the institutions that produce the content. It does not have access to the production archive. It cannot compel the release of materials that are being withheld. But it can document what is known, track what is sought, and create a record that makes it easier to find what exists when it surfaces. The fan community's archive is itself a kind of found content. The aggregate of episode comparisons, difference documentation, tracking of regional variations, and careful notation of what is confirmed existing versus what is rumored versus what is known to be lost. This material constitutes a picture of the show that no single source could provide. It is built from the collective attention of many people watching the same thing from different angles over many years. Part 40. The Night's End and the Incomplete Record. Everything explored in these hours of conversation exists in relation to a central fact. The show that you can watch right now, on whatever streaming service or cable channel or physical media you choose to access it through, is an incomplete version of what was made. This is true of almost all long-running media in some sense. Every show leaves material on the cutting room floor. Every production generates more than it broadcasts. The gap between what was made and what is available is a standard feature of the landscape of media production. But Family Guy's gap is larger, more documented, and more interesting than most, for reasons that are specific to the show's history. The two canceled and revived cycles, the creator's near survival of September 11th and its influence on the show's content, the network relationship that produced both successful commercial results and ongoing creative tension, the specific episodes that were formally suppressed, the scenes that were altered by specific documented decisions, the early seasons whose deleted scenes were never archived, the pitch pilot that wandered for nearly 3 decades. The theories that fans have built on top of this incomplete record are attempts to make meaning in the gaps. Some of them are coherent and interesting. Some of them are purely inventive. The best ones gesture towards something real even when their specific claims are not. What is real is this: a show that ran for 25 years, made by a team of people whose relationship with each other and with the institutional forces governing the production changed continuously, produced a body of content that is larger and stranger and more layered than the simple catalog of available episodes suggests. The gaps in the archive are part of the show. The missing episodes are part of the story. The theories are part of the cultural life of a piece of work that has meant something to a generation of viewers, and whatever is still out there, in whatever informal archive some animator's personal website constitutes, in whatever storage drive some production assistant took home when the hiatus years scattered the original team, in whatever archive of recording sessions and early drafts and discarded directions sits somewhere in the Fox infrastructure, whatever is still out there is still waiting to be found. The night is long enough for all of this and more. The dark is a good place to sit with the not yet known. We have been at this for a while. If you are still here, in whatever quiet corner of the world you have settled into tonight, that is its own kind of confirmation. There is something in the space between the documented and the possible that is worth spending time in. Thank you for spending it here. If you want more of this, subscribe. It makes more of it possible. Comment what time it is and where you are in the world if you have not already. And leave any questions or requests in the comments. There is always more in the archive. Sleep well. Part 41. The specific weight of Season 3 and what was never retrieved. Season 3 of Family Guy holds a particular position in the show's history. It was the last season of the original run, the season that ended with cancellation and a 3-year absence. And it is, by the assessment of most people who have watched the show carefully, the peak of the show's creative output, the season where everything that had been built in Seasons 1 and 2 arrived at a kind of culmination before the show disappeared. The season produced Road to Rhode Island, which by common consensus is the single best episode the show made. It produced When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the episode that was shelved for 3 years and ultimately aired to less controversy than anyone anticipated. It produced the kind of character work that the show would spend its subsequent 2-0-plus seasons struggling to replicate. The balance of comedy and genuine feeling that made the early run memorable to the people who watched it. And it is the season from which no full-color deleted scenes have ever been officially released. The implications of that absence are worth sitting with carefully. The show was producing, at its creative best, content that was being cut for time or for content reasons, and that was not preserved in any accessible archival format. The writer's room was generating more material than the episodes could contain, and that excess material simply does not exist in any form that fans or researchers can access. What was in those deleted scenes from the peak season? The question is genuinely unanswerable, but some inferences are possible. In a season where the broadcast episodes were of the quality that Season 3 produced, the deleted material was being cut from a high baseline. Scenes that did not make it into episodes that were already this good were not necessarily weaker than what aired. Sometimes scenes get cut for structural reasons rather than quality reasons, because an episode runs long, because a joke that works on paper slows the pace when animated, because two scenes are doing the same work and only one can stay. The deleted scenes from Season 3 would have included material involving the early version of Stewie, the version that was closest to the show's original conception of the character as a genuine villain. They would have included early Brian content, Brian at his most sympathetic and most carefully written. They would have included scenes in the register that the season's best episodes occupied, funny in a way that also had emotional weight, comedic in a way that did not sacrifice character for laughs. None of that material is accessible. The 3-year period between the show's cancellation and its revival was not a period during which anyone was thinking carefully about archival preservation of production materials from the canceled show. The people who had worked on the show moved on to other projects. The physical materials, whatever form they took, were likely stored in ways that assumed they would never be needed again. When the show came back, the focus was on what was next, not on what had been left behind. The Season 3 deleted scenes represent, in the lost content framework, a gap that is particularly painful precisely because it sits at the center of what the show did best. Everything else that is missing from the archive has some mitigation. The later seasons' deleted scenes are available even if the early ones are not. The episodes that were suppressed can be accessed through other means in many cases. The pitch pilot was recovered, but the deleted material from the show's creative peak remains genuinely absent, and there is no particular reason to expect that it will surface. The principle that applies here is one worth stating explicitly. The things we most want to recover from a creative archive are often precisely the things that were least carefully preserved at the time. The material from the early seasons, when the show was uncertain of its own future, was not maintained with the same institutional care that was applied to material from later seasons, when the show's commercial value was established and the infrastructure for archiving was in place. This is a pattern that recurs across media history. The most creatively significant periods of a work's life are sometimes the worst documented, because the investment in documentation tends to come after the investment in survival. Part 42. The quiet persistence of things not found. In the years since Family Guy became the object of serious fan archival attention, the community that does this work has developed a specific and somewhat counterintuitive insight. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, but it is also not automatically evidence of presence. The discipline required to work in this territory is the discipline of sitting with genuine uncertainty without resolving it artificially in either direction. The pitch pilot existed for 27 years without being found. For most of that time, the community tracking its status listed it as existence unconfirmed. The inference that it must exist somewhere, because someone made it and submitted it to a network that then greenlit the show, was strong enough that people kept looking. But the absence of a confirmed location meant that the search remained open. When it was found, on Robert Paulson's personal website, the discovery validated the methodology: patient, careful searching for something whose existence was inferred from evidence rather than confirmed from access. This methodology applies to everything else in the incomplete archive. The deleted scenes from seasons 1 through 3 exist in a state of existence confirmed by evidence, location and full content unknown. The promotional materials from 1999 that show 2 brief clips confirm that deleted scene material from the first season was produced. The inference that more than just those 2 visible clips was generated in the production process is strongly supported by standard understanding of how television production works. But the location of that material, if it survives anywhere accessible, is unknown. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein early draft is in a similar state, partially documented, its existence confirmed through an account that then became inaccessible. The script that was partially photographed and shared in 2020 before the file was lost is still out there somewhere. Whoever created the PDF still has access to whatever they accessed to create it. The information is not destroyed, it is just not currently in circulation. The song The List from the Season 6 two-parter is confirmed by database records to have existed as produced content from the November 2007 broadcast period. Its audio recording and animation exist somewhere, in whatever archival form Fox's production archive takes. The question is whether it will ever be released, not whether it exists. Each of these items is in a different state of accessibility, but what they share is that the work required to find or release them is finite. The pitch pilot's recovery required someone to look in the right place on the internet. The early draft script's recovery would require the person who has it to make it available again. The Season 6 song's release would require whoever controls the relevant archive to decide to release it. None of these are impossible. Some of them are more likely than others. All of them remain in the category of possible future recoveries. The history of lost media recovery is a history of things that seemed permanently inaccessible turning out not to be once the right person looked in the right place. It is also a history of things that seemed close to recovery remaining just out of reach for years because the person who holds the key has no particular incentive to use it. The Family Guy archive sits somewhere in this landscape, partially recovered, partially accessible through unconventional means, partially documented through secondary evidence, and partially genuinely missing. The shape of the archive that remains to be filled in is visible in outline even if the content is not. And the community that does this work continues to look, with the patience that this kind of search requires. Part 43. Why this matters beyond the show itself. There is a question worth addressing directly before this long night concludes. Why does any of this matter? Family Guy is a cartoon. It has been on television for 25 years. Its archive being incomplete is true of virtually every comparable show. The specific content that has been suppressed or modified or lost is not earth-shattering in its significance. Why spend this much attention on what a Fox animated comedy was prevented from saying and what got cut from its production? The answer is something like this. The history of what gets suppressed and what gets preserved in a piece of popular media is a record of the pressures that shaped that culture during the period in question. The decisions made about When You Wish Upon a Weinstein in 2000 tell you something about American corporate media's relationship with Jewish representation at that moment. The suppression of partial terms of endearment in 2010 tells you something about the specific and ongoing intensity of the American political conflict over reproductive rights, and the degree to which mainstream broadcast media felt unable to engage with that conflict in any form that was not formally neutral. The removal of the Bin Laden airport scene tells you something about the profound shift in American culture that September 11th produced, a shift severe enough that a throwaway joke made a year earlier could no longer exist in the standard distribution of a television show. These are not Family Guy stories specifically, they are American stories that Family Guy happened to be part of. The show, because of its willingness to engage with exactly the kinds of topics that mainstream broadcast media tended to avoid, found itself repeatedly at the intersection of popular comedy and institutional constraint. The record of where those intersections occurred, what content they produced, and how the content was handled is a record of something beyond the show itself. The fan theories generated around the show are interesting for a similar reason. The Peter in a mental institution theory is not true as a description of the show, but it emerged from and speaks to something true about the cultural moment in which it was generated. The sense that the things we watch for entertainment sometimes contain more darkness than they acknowledge, that the comfort they offer is sometimes built on foundations that are less stable than they appear, that the reset button that allows fictional families to survive impossible things is itself a kind of wish that needs examining. The show as a whole, in its complete archive, including its gaps, is a document of what American popular culture was doing with comedy during the first quarter of the 21st century, how it engaged with tragedy, how it negotiated the boundaries of what could be said, how it handled the tension between commercial imperatives and creative intentions, and how it processed, through the medium of a cartoon family in a fictional Rhode Island town, some of the defining experiences and anxieties of the period. All of that is worth caring about. Not because Family Guy is art in the most elevated sense of the word, but because popular culture is where a society works through things it cannot work through in any other form, and understanding what got into that culture, what got kept out of it, and what got changed in the process of getting in, is part of understanding what the culture was. Part 44. The record as it stands. Let us be precise about what is known, as a final accounting before the night ends. The show has 2 episodes that have never aired on American broadcast television. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was produced in 2000 and held from broadcast until 2003, when it aired on Adult Swim, and until 2004, when Fox aired a modified version. Partial Terms of Endearment was produced in 2010 and has never aired in the United States on any television network. It is available on DVD and has aired internationally, but is not available on Hulu. The show has one episode, Turban Cowboy, that was pulled from streaming platforms following the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013 and was not restored to Hulu until September 2022. It remains unavailable on Disney Plus in the American market. The show has one scene, From Road to Rhode Island, that was removed from the standard domestic distribution of the episode after the 11th of September 2001 and exists in its original form only in certain specific release formats. The show has a body of deleted scenes from its first 3 seasons that has never been released in any official format. Evidence that these scenes exist comes from promotional materials from 1999. The show has a 1,998-pitch pilot that was considered lost media for nearly 30 years and was recovered in March 2025 when it was found on the personal portfolio website of an animator who worked on it. The show has a deleted musical number, The List, from the Season 6 two-parter, documented in television databases as produced content that was not included in the final broadcast. The show has a direct-to-DVD film, Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, that was released in an 8-minute version in 2005, and then broadcast in a 6-minute edited version in 2006, with the DVD version containing scenes and content not available in the broadcast cut. The show has an early draft of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein that was partially documented in 2020 before the documentation became inaccessible, and that represents a version of the episode significantly different from what aired. All of this is documented. All of it is as accurate as the available sources allow it to be. The record as it stands is incomplete, and the incompleteness is structural rather than accidental. What remains outside the record, in the informal archives and the production storage and the personal hard drives and the memories of the people who were in the room, is the territory that this whole night has been circling. Not with the expectation of resolving it, but with the attention that incomplete things deserve. And that is where we rest. The record open-ended, the archive imperfect, the night doing what nights do. Wherever you are, whatever time it reads, thank you for spending it here. Subscribe if you want more of this, comment if you want to be part of the conversation, and sleep well, in the knowledge that some things are still out there, waiting to be found.